Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. Have you ever looked at an old photograph and felt like the people in it were staring back at you? I don't mean the usual feeling you get when you look at a picture, just a quick moment of nostalgia or curiosity. No, I mean the feeling that they know you, that they see something you can't. I never understood that sensation until it started happening to me. It all began one evening while I was sorting through some boxes I found in my attic. I had just moved into my new apartment, and the task of organizing everything had left me feeling a bit overwhelmed. Most of the boxes were full of junk, old clothes, random trinkets, and some family heirlooms that I didn't remember. But one box, in particular, caught my eye. It was an old, leather-bound photo album that looked as though it had been forgotten for decades. I pulled it out, dusted it off, and opened it. The first page was full of black and white photographs. They looked like they had been taken long ago, maybe in the early 20th century. Faces smiled back at me, people dressed in old-fashioned clothes, standing on porches, in gardens, or gathered around dinner tables. They were strangers to me, but they felt familiar, as if I had seen them somewhere before. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination. But then something strange happened. As I turned the page, one of the figures in the photograph shifted. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but there it was again. The woman in the photo, dressed in a flowing gown, had been smiling in the first picture. Now, she wasn't. Her expression was stern, her eyes narrowed, as if she was looking directly at me. I froze. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The photograph was exactly the same as it had been moments before. The woman was still smiling, her expression soft. I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself I had just imagined it. But the feeling of unease lingered. It wasn't just the photographs themselves that unsettled me. It was the silence that filled the room after I turned the page. There was no longer the soft rustle of the old paper, the comfortable sound of pages flipping, only a strange stillness. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, but everything else felt distant. I closed the album, a strange sense of dread creeping over me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence felt too deep, too suffocating. And for the first time, I felt the distinct impression that I wasn't alone in the room. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just the familiar, empty walls of my apartment. Shaking my head, I placed the album back in the box and decided to continue with my evening. But as I moved away, I noticed something. A soft creak. It was coming from the album, as though it were shifting on its own. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the box. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't want to open the album again, but I couldn't help myself. I walked back slowly, pulled the album out of the box, and opened it to the last page I had seen. To my horror, the woman was no longer smiling. She was standing, her hand pressed against the glass of the photograph, her face now twisted in a look of desperation. And her eyes were no longer vacant. They were watching me. I slammed the album shut, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure: something had shifted. I quickly placed the album back into the box and shut the lid. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to steady myself. I couldn't shake the image of those eyes, so real, so alive. I felt like they were still watching me. It wasn't just the woman in the photo. I knew that now. Something had changed in those pictures, something I couldn't understand. I had thought the old photos were just relics of the past, but they were something more, something dangerous. And I didn't know if I was ready to find out just how dangerous they could be. But as I turned to leave the attic, I heard it again. A soft, creaking sound, like footsteps, but they were coming from the photo album. From somewhere deep within the silence, I could almost hear the faintest whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me." And I knew in that moment that this wasn't over. The past wasn't finished with me yet. It was just beginning. The night passed slowly. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the unease that gripped me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes, those desperate, pleading eyes of the woman in the photo. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push the image out of my mind. And I couldn't understand why I felt so drawn to the album, as though something was compelling me to go back, to look deeper. But I couldn't. I couldn't face it again. Not after what happened. The next morning, I tried to go about my day as usual. I made coffee, checked my emails, and forced myself to leave the house to run errands. But nothing felt normal. The world around me seemed muted, like a dull version of itself, and the weight of the album's mystery hung over me like a storm cloud, never far from my mind. When I returned home that afternoon, I noticed something strange. The box that held the photo album was no longer on the shelf where I had left it. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly checked the living room, but it wasn't there. I moved through the apartment, each room growing colder, the silence deeper, until I finally found it. It was on the kitchen counter. But it was open. The pages were spread out in front of me, as if someone had been looking through it. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't opened it since the night before, had I? No, I was sure I hadn't. But someone, or something, had. I approached cautiously, my steps slow and deliberate. The photos on the pages seemed unchanged at first glance, but I noticed a small detail that wasn't there before. The woman from the photograph, the one who had been staring at me, was now standing outside of the frame. Her figure was faint, like a shadow cast against the background, but she was there, unmistakably present in the room with me. I could feel her eyes on me, pulling me in, as though the photo was no longer just a relic of the past, but a portal to something much darker. I slammed the album shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain how the photo had changed, how the woman had stepped out of the frame. But there was no denying it. Something unnatural was happening, something I couldn't ignore any longer. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. Then, a sudden noise broke the silence, a soft thud, like something heavy had fallen in the next room. My pulse quickened, and I slowly turned toward the source of the sound. The living room was empty. But then I saw it. There, on the wall, hanging crookedly, was a frame. The same frame I had seen in the photograph. It wasn't supposed to be there. I walked toward it, my feet feeling as though they were made of lead. As I got closer, I could see the image inside. It was the same woman, her expression now twisted into a grotesque grin. But what was most disturbing was the fact that she was standing in the same position as she had in the photograph, only now, her hands were raised, as if reaching for something. I reached out to touch the frame, but before my fingers made contact, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. There was no one there. Just the empty, quiet room. But as I turned back to the picture, I froze. The woman's eyes were no longer locked on the photo. They were looking directly at me, and I could feel her gaze, cold and piercing, as though she had crossed over from the image into the real world. A shiver ran down my spine. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. But it felt real. Too real. I stepped back, but the frame seemed to follow me, its presence now all-encompassing, filling the room with a sense of claustrophobic terror. I could hear her voice, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. "Help me." I stumbled backward, bumping into the table behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room felt smaller, darker. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I turned to flee, the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The sound of footsteps, closer now, relentless, echoed through the apartment, filling the silence. The walls seemed to close in around me. I turned back to the frame, my mind a whirl of confusion and fear. The woman was no longer just a figure in the photo. She was alive, her movements slow, deliberate. And she was coming for me. With trembling hands, I grabbed the photo album from the counter, intending to close it for good, to destroy it if I had to. But as I opened it, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The photos were changing again. The people in the pictures, once frozen in time, were now moving, shifting, blinking, stepping out of their frames and into the room with me. Their eyes followed me, their expressions changing with every glance. And behind them, I could see the shadow, the woman, growing closer. I had no idea what was happening or how to stop it. But one thing was clear, the past was no longer a distant memory. It had come alive, and it was hunting me down. And I didn't know how much longer I could survive. Panic surged through me as I backed away from the encroaching shadows, my mind scrambling for a way out. But there was no escape. The room had become a cage, the walls closing in on me with every breath I took. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the photographs, those cursed photographs, seemed to multiply with every second. I turned my eyes away from the haunting images, focusing instead on the door. It was locked, of course. I had locked it when I came in, but now it seemed different. There was something off about the door, something unnatural. As though it no longer belonged to this space. My hand gripped the handle, and I tried to twist it, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps, those terrible footsteps, grew louder. I could hear them behind me, circling around, getting closer. Each step echoed off the walls like the beat of a drum, rhythmic and menacing. I dared not turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to do something, anything, to escape, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The presence behind me was suffocating, a weight pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. Then, a voice, soft at first, a whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Come back." It wasn't just the woman anymore. There were others, too. The figures from the photographs, now fully formed, their faces twisted in silent pleas, their eyes pleading for release. I could see their hands reaching toward me, stretching from the frames, their fingers grazing the edges of the walls as they pulled themselves into reality. The room grew colder. I gasped, feeling the temperature drop, my breath coming out in visible puffs. The shadows had taken shape. I wasn't just surrounded by the images now, they were with me, in the room, alive. I needed to leave. Now. I ran to the window, but as I reached it, I froze. The glass had turned to dark, solid shadows, like ink spilled over a canvas. I couldn't see outside anymore. There was no light beyond the glass, only darkness. The darkness of the images, the void that reached for me, wrapping around me like a shroud. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. It was too late for the window. The door. I had to get to the door. I rushed back to it, desperation fueling my movements. But as I reached out to twist the handle once again, the world around me shifted. The room seemed to fold in on itself, the walls stretching and bending in unnatural angles. The ceiling dipped lower, the floor rising higher, trapping me further inside the collapsing space. The woman, the figure from the photo, was there now, standing directly in front of me. Her face, once calm, now twisted in agony. She reached out a hand, her fingers thin and elongated, the nails sharp as though clawing through the fabric of the air itself. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, bore into mine. "Help me," she whispered, her voice chilling and cold, like a dying breath. But I wasn't sure if it was a plea for mercy or a command. Was she the one who needed help? Or was it me? I stumbled back, my breath shallow and ragged. The walls seemed to close in further, the air growing thick and heavy. The room was no longer just a room, it was a living, breathing thing, pulsating with the energy of the images that had come to life. I needed to make it stop. I had to find a way to stop it. But as I turned to face the others, those twisted, silent figures, they too began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, as if they had all decided, at once, to come to life. Their eyes locked on mine, following my every move with unnerving precision. One by one, the figures from the photographs stepped out of their frames, the sounds of creaking wood and rustling paper filling the air. And I realized this was no longer just a haunting. These weren't mere ghosts. They were the past, the forgotten moments, now broken free from the confines of time. And they were coming for me. With trembling hands, I grabbed the nearest photograph, the one of the woman who had first caught my eye. It was the one that had started all of this. I tried to tear it apart, to destroy it, to burn it, anything to stop the madness. But as I touched the edge of the paper, I felt something, a strange pull, as though the image itself was alive, clinging to my skin. Suddenly, the room went silent. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was nothing. No footsteps, no whispering voices, no shadows. The figures, frozen in place, stared at me, their eyes still lifeless and empty. But then, slowly, I heard it, the faintest sound, like the whisper of a breeze through dry leaves. It came from the photograph I held in my hand, and before I could react, the woman's face in the picture smiled. It wasn't a smile of kindness. It was a smile of recognition. She knew me. She had always known me. And in that moment, I understood the truth. The photographs weren't just memories. They were doors to a world that shouldn't have existed, doors to the past that refused to stay buried. And now, they were all coming back to claim me. I had no idea how I could survive this. How could you escape when the past refuses to let go? As the woman stepped closer, her smile widening, I could only feel the coldness of the room and the growing certainty that my fate had already been sealed. The coldness deepened, gnawing at my bones. The woman, her eyes still locked onto mine, stepped closer. Her smile stretched wider, a grotesque mockery of the once serene expression she had worn in the photograph. The others, those who had once been trapped in the frames, were slowly advancing too, their movements eerily synchronized, as if some invisible force was pulling them toward me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. Every inch of my body felt paralyzed, as if the air itself had turned to stone, weighing me down. My heart thundered in my chest, but the sound of it seemed to drown out everything else, making the silence even more suffocating. I tried to tear my gaze away, but their eyes followed me, penetrating my very soul. I looked at the door again, willing it to open, but it remained stubbornly locked. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but it was like trying to find a way through thick fog. Everything felt impossible. The woman's fingers twitched, reaching toward me. It was as if she were pulling the very air closer to her, drawing me in. And then, her voice, a soft whisper, barely audible, but laced with cold malice, reached my ears. "Why did you look?" I didn't know how to answer. I didn't even know what she meant. What had I looked at? What had I discovered? I wanted to forget, she continued, her voice trembling. "But you brought us back." The others were closing in. Their faces twisted in silent anguish, their mouths opening as though they wished to speak, but no sound came. I could feel their presence, their hands almost grazing my skin. Every inch of me screamed to run, to escape, but I couldn't make my legs move. The woman was right in front of me now. Her breath, cold and damp, brushed against my face. Her eyes were so close that I could see the veins beneath the skin, the dull sheen of the tears she had shed in her own time. Her mouth parted, her smile now a twisted grimace, and in a sudden, terrifying motion, she reached out to touch my face. Her fingers were ice cold. "No," I gasped, trying to jerk back, but the more I moved, the tighter her grip became. The pressure was unbearable, as if she were pulling me into the photograph itself, pulling me into her world. And then, the floor beneath me began to tremble. A low hum vibrated through the air, a deep, resonating sound that felt like it was coming from everywhere, from the very walls, from the photographs themselves. It wasn't just the woman reaching for me anymore, the entire room was coming alive, twisting and warping with the power of the past, of the forgotten souls in the pictures. The shadows seemed to stretch and grow, consuming everything in their path. The photographs on the walls began to change again. Faces in the frames shifted, as if the people were moving, adjusting their positions, blinking their eyes. One of them, an old man with a grizzled beard, looked straight at me, his expression darkening with an unmistakable sense of recognition. He was smiling now, but it was a smile filled with malice, his eyes narrowing as if daring me to resist. And then, as if they were waiting for something, the figures in the photographs stepped forward, not just as shadows, but as full, solid forms. The woman, the man, the others, each one emerged from their frames, their features becoming more distinct with every passing second. They were no longer trapped in their photos. They were here, in my world, in my space. I could feel their cold breath, smell the mildew of old houses, the musty scent of forgotten memories. The woman's fingers dug deeper into my skin, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I was losing myself to them. I could already feel the pull of their world, their time. They were coming to take me. The walls shifted again, a low grinding noise reverberating around the room as though the house itself were groaning in protest. The photographs on the walls twisted, the edges curling and curling until the paper began to tear apart, revealing nothing but endless darkness behind them. It was as if the house was being consumed by the same force that had brought these figures to life. They weren't just haunting me, they were unraveling reality itself, breaking through the very fabric of time. You should never have looked, the woman whispered again, her voice now a low, guttural growl. The warmth of her breath was replaced by something colder, more oppressive. Her touch was no longer gentle but sharp, like icy tendrils sinking into my skin. I couldn't breathe. The darkness behind the photographs seemed to stretch into infinity, and I realized, too late, that I had made a terrible mistake. The past wasn't just something I had uncovered. It was something alive, something that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But no sound came, and my legs were too heavy to move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped between this world and the other, between the past and the present. I felt myself being pulled backward, as if I were sinking into the very walls, into the images, into their world. My vision blurred as the figures reached for me, their cold hands brushing against my skin, dragging me toward the photographs. My body twisted at impossible angles, my mind fractured, unable to comprehend what was happening. It was like being pulled into a dream that wasn't my own, where the past bled into the present and everything was distorted, broken. And then, just as I thought I might lose everything, my mind, my soul, there was a sudden silence. The pull stopped. The figures were gone. The photographs were still there, hanging on the walls, frozen in time. But the room, my room, had returned to normal. The walls were solid. The air was still. The only sound was the beating of my own heart, frantic in my chest. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, unable to process what had just happened. But as I looked around, something caught my eye. A new photograph had appeared on the wall. It was me, and I was smiling. I stared at the photograph, my breath caught in my throat. There I was, frozen in time, smiling in the same unnatural way the others had. The same smile I had seen on the faces of the figures who had emerged from their frames. The same smile that now spread across my own face, as if I had become one of them. I couldn't look away. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out with trembling hands, my fingers brushing against the cold glass that encased the photograph. The moment I touched it, a shock of cold jolted through my body, as though the image was alive, pulsing with energy from some otherworldly realm. I stepped back, my mind racing. Was this a new trap? Was I now part of their collection, destined to become one of them? I tried to tear my eyes away, but something kept pulling me back, like an invisible force keeping me tethered to the image. The house around me seemed to breathe, shifting and warping again. The shadows in the corners of the room grew long and jagged, flickering like old film. I could hear whispers, faint at first, like voices coming from behind the walls. They were words, just sounds that made my skin crawl. And then, something worse. Footsteps. Soft and slow, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was moving toward me. My blood ran cold. I knew what was happening. The figures, the ones I had seen in the photographs, weren't gone. They were coming for me again. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt like lead. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, as if the very air had thickened, making movement almost impossible. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were in the room with me now. And then, the whispers turned into words. Join us. The voice was no longer faint. It was real. Close. It came from behind me, and when I spun around, I saw her, the woman, standing there in front of the doorway, her eyes still locked on mine, her smile now a twisted grimace. The others were there too. The man with the beard, the children, all of them alive, stepping out from the photographs, their figures becoming more defined, more corporeal with each passing second. "Why did you take the picture?" she asked, her voice laced with a strange mix of curiosity and malice. "Why did you let us out?" I didn't mean to," I whispered, my throat dry. "I didn't know." "You saw too much," she said. "And now, you belong to us." The shadows in the room seemed to close in around me. The walls were no longer solid, they pulsed with an eerie energy like the beating of a heart. The photographs seemed to grow, their frames stretching and distorting, the faces inside them coming to life, their eyes moving, their mouths opening in silent screams. I turned back to the photograph of me. The one where I was smiling. The one that wasn't there before. I had to get rid of it. I had to stop this before it consumed me completely. But how? How could I destroy something that had already become part of this reality? Was I even in my own world anymore? I ran toward the photograph, grabbing it from the wall with shaking hands. The moment I pulled it free, the room seemed to collapse inward. The walls shook, and the floor beneath my feet cracked open, revealing darkness. The house was no longer a place of safety. It had become a prison, a gateway between this world and the one from which these figures had come. I could hear them now, footsteps, their cold, unrelenting steps echoing around me. They were closer, closer than ever. I had to act quickly. With the photograph still in my hand, I sprinted toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, panic rising in my chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Join us," they repeated. "It's too late." I turned around in desperation, the photograph still clutched tightly in my hand. The woman was there, standing right behind me now, her face inches from mine. Her cold, damp breath washed over me, and I could feel the temperature drop in the room. And then, in a final burst of adrenaline, I threw the photograph into the air, watching it spin as if suspended in time. As it twirled in the air, it seemed to tear open the very fabric of the room, creating a crack in the air, a doorway between the past and the present. The room exploded with a deafening sound, a roar that vibrated through my very bones. The figures in the photographs screamed, their voices now loud and violent. The woman reached out, her fingers inches from my skin, but just as they touched, the photograph shattered. The world around me collapsed into darkness. I woke up on the floor of my apartment, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. The room was quiet, still. Everything seemed normal. The photographs were where they had always been, the frames untouched. I was alone. But when I stood up, I noticed something. The photograph of me, the one that had appeared on the wall, was gone. And in its place was another photograph. A new one. This time, it was of me standing in front of the house, smiling, just as I had been in the picture that had first appeared on the wall. I froze. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A figure, slowly stepping out from the shadows. It wasn't just a memory anymore. It was alive. And it was coming for me. The question echoes in my mind like a distant murmur in the dark. What could possibly go wrong with a simple film screening? But that question lingers, unsettling, because I know that nothing is ever as simple as it seems. My job as a cinema operator is routine. It's late, the theater is empty except for me, and I'm sitting in the control room, staring at a film reel. It's a new release, one of those films that's supposed to shock and captivate. Tonight, I have the task of screening it before the premiere. A standard procedure, they say. Watch the film, check for any issues, make sure it plays right. No one else is supposed to be here. No distractions. Just me and the film. But I can feel it, the strange weight in the air, the unnerving stillness. Everything feels heavier tonight. The room is cold, though the heater hums steadily. I glance over at the clock on the wall. It's a few minutes before midnight. There's something about the hour, something that seems to distort time and space. I place the reel on the projector, the old machinery creaking under the pressure of its task. The screen flickers to life, casting a faint glow that stretches across the dark room. The film begins. At first, it's like any other, a simple opening scene establishing shots of a small town, a few characters walking down a quiet street. But something feels off. The sound is crisp, unnaturally clear, too perfect, like it's reaching deep into my skull. The soft hum of the projector should be a comforting background noise, but instead, it's grating. My fingers twitch at the buttons, as if something might go wrong at any moment. As the film progresses, subtle things begin to shift. The shadows on screen seem longer than they should be. The street lights in the film flicker, and the sound of footsteps on gravel echoes unnervingly in the otherwise quiet room. I look over at the control panel, checking for any technical issues, but everything appears fine. The projector hums steadily, the screen remains sharp and clear. But it's the silence around me that is beginning to unsettle me. The theater is usually alive with the sound of audience chatter, the rustle of popcorn bags, the distant murmur of conversations. Tonight, however, it's just me and the film. It feels wrong. The silence is thick, oppressive, like the air itself is holding its breath. The film seems to stretch on, longer than it should. The characters on screen, just ordinary people, start to look strange. Their faces are too still, too perfect, like mannequins caught in an endless loop of their actions. There's a sharpness to their movements now, a rigidness that wasn't there at first. My eyes strain to focus, but the images keep shifting in odd ways, like they're warping. I glance nervously around the control room, feeling a strange pressure on my chest. The walls are closing in. No, that can't be right. I blink hard, trying to clear the strange sensations. I need to focus. It's just a film. Just a film. But something's wrong with it. I can't shake the feeling that it's not just a film. It's as if the story is creeping into the space around me, pulling me into its world, piece by piece. A creak behind me, a whisper in the air. I turn quickly, but there's nothing there. The room is empty. Still. Silent. I swallow hard, turning back to the screen. But the footage, it's no longer just a story. It's alive. The people on screen, now in a narrow alleyway, their faces twisted with terror, look directly at me. Their eyes, no, their gaze shifts as if they can see me through the screen. A chill runs down my spine. I feel my heart beat faster, my breath growing shallow. The footsteps on screen grow louder. They're too loud. My fingers tremble as I reach for the volume dial, but nothing changes. The sound keeps rising, echoing in the quiet of the room. I try to stand, but my legs feel weak. I grip the armrests, feeling them dig into my palms. I look up again. The alley on the screen is darker now. The shadows are stretching, growing larger, twisting in unnatural ways. The figures on screen are closer now, so close I can almost hear their breathing. My skin prickles. Something is wrong. But what if it's just my mind playing tricks on me? I try to convince myself, but a small voice in the back of my head whispers that it's not just the film. It's something else. Something watching. I try to focus, to tell myself it's all in my head. The projector hums steadily. The screen is just showing a story, nothing more. But the air feels thicker now, as if it's pressing in from all sides. My heart is pounding, and every creak of the old building seems magnified, like it's being broadcasted in my ears. The figures on the screen move again, their steps growing more deliberate, more precise. The alleyway now feels suffocating, as if the walls are closing in on them. The characters, still locked in their unnatural, frozen expressions, begin to look more aware. I can't explain it, but something has changed. Their eyes, once distant and hollow, are now filled with something. Something that feels far too real. They're looking at me. No, they're looking through me, as if they can see straight into my soul. I shift in my seat, trying to shake the feeling off, but the coldness in the room is unbearable now. The temperature has dropped. The breath on my skin feels like fingers brushing against me. I glance back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But again, there's nothing. The room is as empty as it was before. Still, that sense of being watched refuses to leave me. I press my hands to my face, hoping to shake off the panic building in my chest. The screen flashes, a quick cut to something that wasn't there before. A shadow, something out of place in the background. It lingers for a moment before the frame cuts away, but I saw it. I saw it clear as day. A figure. Tall, cloaked in black, standing just outside the alley, watching. Watching them. Watching me. I try to pause the film, but the controls don't respond. The buttons feel stiff, unyielding, as if the machine itself is resisting me. I slam my hand down on the panel, panic rising in my throat. The figure on screen begins to move now, walking toward the camera, toward me, its shadow stretching unnaturally far. The footsteps are louder, heavier. They're not just a part of the film anymore, they're real. I can feel them. I turn back to the screen, my eyes wide in disbelief. The figure reaches the camera, and for a split second, its face comes into view. No, not a face, just a smooth, featureless mask. The figure leans forward, as if pressing against the film itself, and in that moment, I swear it's looking straight at me. A sharp click, like a switch being flipped, echoes through the room. The film freezes. Everything goes still. But then the projector hums louder, the sound vibrating through my skull. The screen flickers violently. I stand up, suddenly overwhelmed with an urge to flee. But my legs feel heavy, like they're made of stone. The door to the control room is too far away, and I can't bring myself to move. I watch in horror as the screen changes. The alley is gone now, replaced by the inside of the cinema. The dark, empty rows of seats are now visible, stretching infinitely, as if the theater has multiplied. It's an impossible vision, like the space itself is warping. And then I see them. The figures, standing motionless in the seats. Hundreds of them, all staring at the screen, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their faces obscured by darkness. I can't move. I can't look away. They're there, they're watching me. They are all watching me. I reach for the controls again, desperate, but my fingers feel numb. The film resumes, the figures on screen turning to face the camera. And then, slowly, they begin to step forward, toward the screen, their movements jerky, unnatural. The sound of footsteps grows louder, like an army marching, relentless. I press my hands to my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it's inside my head now. My vision blurs. The figures on screen are no longer just actors, they are something else, something far worse. Their eyes are wide, filled with a dark emptiness, and they are moving closer. I can't breathe. I can't think. I can't escape. The room starts to spin, the walls closing in on me. I'm trapped in the darkness. There's no way out. The film is alive. It's not just a movie, it's a curse, a force, and it's pulling me into its world. The footsteps are deafening now, so close, so real. I can hear them moving behind me, in the aisles, in the shadows. I turn, but there's nothing there. I look back at the screen. The figures are now standing in front of it, their faces inches from the lens. They're not on the screen anymore. They're in the room with me. I can feel their cold breath on my neck, their eyes piercing into me. I know what's coming next. It's already here. And then, in an instant, everything goes black. I don't know how long I've been sitting here, but when I finally open my eyes, the room is still dark. The screen is blank now, empty, but the projector hums faintly in the background. The silence is deafening, a crushing weight pressing down on me. I blink rapidly, trying to clear the fog from my mind. My hands are shaking, and my heart is pounding like a drum in my chest. I stand up slowly, my legs unsteady. I feel like I've been asleep for days, even though I know it's only been minutes, maybe less. The control room feels different now. The walls seem too close, the air too thick. There's a lingering scent, faint but unmistakable, like something burning. I turn toward the door, but it feels far away, too far. I take a step forward, but my feet feel heavy, like they're sinking into the floor with every movement. The room seems to sway slightly, as if it's breathing, shifting around me. I shake my head, trying to steady myself, but the dizziness only grows worse. And then, I hear it again. A whisper. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It's coming from the screen. No, it's not just the screen. It's coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the very air itself. The sound of a voice. But it's not a voice I recognize. It's low, raspy, like something trying to claw its way out of the darkness. The whisper is too clear now, too urgent. Turn it off. I freeze. The voice is chillingly familiar. But I can't place it. My skin crawls, and my breath catches in my throat. My eyes flicker to the projector. It's still running, the reel spinning with a steady hum. I walk toward it, my fingers brushing the edge of the console. I reach for the power switch, but my hand hesitates just above it. The whisper grows louder. Turn it off. Before it's too late. I pull my hand back, the fear building inside me, suffocating me. It feels as if the room itself is trying to hold me in place, as if the very walls are alive, breathing with me. I turn back to the screen. The figures are there again, those same twisted, distorted figures, their hollow eyes staring at me. But this time, they're not in the alley. They're in the seats. They're in the very theater, sitting silently, watching me with those empty, soul-crushing eyes. I swallow hard, my throat dry. I'm caught in their gaze. It's as if they can see every part of me, every crack in my mind. My pulse quickens. The voice comes again, louder this time, almost frantic. Stop it. You don't understand. It will consume you. I step back, stumbling over my own feet. The room is spinning now, the shadows shifting, twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. I want to scream, to run, but my legs refuse to move. The weight of the room, of the figures, of the film, it's too much. The screen flickers again. For a brief moment, the figures vanish and a new image appears. It's not a scene from the film. It's the theater, this theater, only it's not empty. The seats are filled, but not with people. It's with something else. Shadows, dark and formless, sitting in the seats. Watching. Waiting. I stagger backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I want to tear my eyes away, but I can't. It's like the screen is pulling me in, drawing me closer to whatever nightmare lies within. The sound of the whisper fills my ears again, louder now, like a deafening roar. Run. You have to leave. It won't stop until it has you. I finally tear my gaze away from the screen, stumbling toward the door, my legs barely supporting me. I push against it, but the door won't open. It's locked. My heart races, and I pound on the door, panic seizing my chest. The whisper is growing louder, almost deafening now, and the walls feel like they're closing in on me. I turn back toward the screen. The figures on screen are gone. Instead, the image of the theater is clearer now, the shadows in the seats more distinct, their outlines more defined. I see movement, slow, deliberate, coming from the back of the room. I can't see their faces, but I know they're coming for me. I try to scream, but no sound escapes. I press my palms against the door, desperate to get out, but the lock refuses to budge. The room is closing in. The air is thick with dread. The figures in the seats are standing now, their bodies jerking and twitching in unnatural ways, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. And then, with a sickening twist, I realize what they are. They're not just watching me. They are me. I collapse against the door, my mind spinning. The figures, they are all versions of me, all distorted, all twisted, with those empty eyes, and they're getting closer. Closer with every breath I take. The whisper reaches its crescendo. Don't fight it. The last thing I hear before the darkness takes me is the sound of footsteps. 1,000 footsteps, all around me, closing in, drowning me in their suffocating rhythm. I wake up in complete darkness. For a moment, I think I'm still in the cinema, still trapped in the nightmare. But the air is different, warmer, less oppressive. I force my eyes open, but it's useless. The darkness is thick, like a heavy blanket smothering me. I reach out, my hands trembling as I fumble for something, anything, to anchor me. My fingers brush against cold metal, smooth and unyielding. A chair, I think. I sit up, my head spinning. My heart pounds against my chest, and I can't tell if it's from the fear or the disorientation. I force myself to breathe, to calm down. It's just a dream, just a dream. It has to be. But when I finally manage to stand, I realize that the air doesn't feel right. The temperature is wrong. There's a musty smell in the air, like old wood and stale air. I'm not in the cinema anymore. I stumble forward, my hands outstretched, trying to find a way out of the darkness. My fingers scrape against the rough walls, and I hear the sound of my breathing filling the space, echoing around me. It feels like I'm in a maze, twisting and turning with no way out. And then I hear it. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. I freeze, my breath catching in my throat. I know those footsteps. They're the same footsteps from the film, the same slow, deliberate steps that echoed in my mind. I whip around, but there's nothing behind me. Only the suffocating darkness. The footsteps stop, and the silence hangs in the air, thick and heavy. I can feel it then. A presence. Something or someone close by. I can't see them, but I can feel them. Like a shadow moving just outside of my vision. Watching me. Waiting. I take a step forward, my legs shaky, and I move through the darkness with the feeling of eyes upon me. The temperature drops again, and I wrap my arms around myself, hoping for some warmth, for some comfort. But there's nothing. Only the oppressive silence and the growing sense of dread. The footsteps resume, closer now. I turn, desperately searching for the source of the sound. I see nothing. The air feels heavier now, thicker, like the very walls of this place are pressing in on me. I want to scream, but my voice catches in my throat. The darkness is suffocating, drowning me in its silence. And then I hear it. A whisper. Come closer. It's faint, almost like a breath, but I hear it. It's unmistakable. My blood runs cold. The voice is familiar, too familiar, but I can't place it. The same voice that warned me in the cinema. The same voice that told me to stop. I step back, my heart racing. I don't want to move forward. I don't want to follow the voice. But my body moves against my will. My legs carry me forward, slowly, unwillingly. It's as if I'm being drawn into the darkness, pulled toward whatever waits ahead. Come closer, the voice repeats, more insistent this time. I don't know how much time passes. It could be minutes or hours. I can't tell anymore. My mind is unraveling, and I'm starting to lose track of what's real. My surroundings shift. The walls feel like they're breathing with me. The temperature keeps changing, cold one moment, hot the next. The air is thick, suffocating, as though the very space is alive and aware of my every movement. The footsteps follow me, relentless, no matter how fast I walk. They're always behind me, just out of reach. I want to run, to escape, but my feet won't obey. I'm stuck in this maze of darkness, with no way out. And then, just as I think I can't take it anymore, I see a flicker of light in the distance. At first, it's barely noticeable, a small dot of brightness in the suffocating dark. But it grows larger, closer. My mind screams at me to turn away, to run, but my body moves forward, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. The footsteps are right behind me now, too close. I can hear the breath, shallow and ragged, just over my shoulder. I reach the light. It's not what I expected. It's not a door or an exit, but another screen. A faint glow illuminates the space before me. And on it is the same theater. The same seats. The same twisted figures. They're there again, all of them, sitting in the same rows. But now, their faces are clearer, more distinct. I can see them now, every one of them, all staring at me. The air freezes. I know what this is now. This isn't just a film. It's a trap. A prison. A never-ending loop. The figures are no longer just characters, they're me. They're all versions of me, distorted, twisted, reflections of the person I used to be. And they are waiting. I try to turn away, but the screen pulls me in. The figures are moving now, slowly, deliberately. Their heads tilt, their eyes following my every move. And in the front row, there's one figure that stands out above the rest. A shadow, a shape, looming over the others. Its eyes are the only thing visible, glowing faintly in the dark. It's watching me, waiting for me to step forward. I know what it wants. It wants me to join them, to become one of them. The whisper comes again, softer now. You belong with us. I close my eyes, trying to block it out, but it's too late. The darkness swallows me whole. The footsteps behind me, the figures in front of me, the whisper in my ears, they all become one. There's no escape now. I've become part of the film. I don't know how long I've been here, trapped in the void between what's real and what isn't. Time doesn't exist anymore. The whispers have stopped, the footsteps have ceased, but the air is thick with the weight of something else, something unspeakable. I try to move, but I can't. I can feel the cold weight of the chair beneath me, the hard, unyielding surface pressing into my legs, but my body refuses to respond. It's as if I've become part of the room itself, part of the very walls that surround me. The film is still playing, looping endlessly in front of me, but I can't look away. The screen flickers once more, the light growing brighter, almost blinding. I squint, but it's no use. The figures are there again, staring at me with their empty eyes, their faces contorted in unnatural ways, frozen in place as they always have been. But this time, they're closer. I can feel them. Their presence presses down on me, surrounding me. They're all around me, sitting in the rows, standing in the aisles. I am part of them now. The figure at the front, the one that always stood out above the rest, steps forward. It's not the same as the others. It doesn't have a face, no features to speak of, only darkness. A void where its face should be, and eyes that shine, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. It moves closer, and I can't turn away. It's like it's calling to me, pulling me in. You've always been one of us, it says, its voice echoing in my mind, 1,000 whispers blending into one. You just didn't know it. I try to scream, to fight, but there's no sound. The room is suffocating, the air thick with an overwhelming pressure, as though it's closing in from all sides. The darkness presses against me like a physical force, like hands gripping my chest, suffocating me. I feel it then, the weight of the film, the weight of the cinema itself, pushing me down, drawing me in, as if I'm part of the very story I've watched unfold. The walls blur around me, becoming fluid, shifting like liquid, the boundaries of the room fading away. The rows of seats dissolve into nothingness, and I am no longer sitting in a theater. I am no longer a person. I am part of the film. The figure with no face steps closer still, its presence overwhelming, filling the space entirely. I try to move, but my limbs are frozen, trapped in place. I can't escape. The figure reaches out a hand, long, dark fingers, cold as ice. It touches my forehead, and the world around me vanishes. Everything is silent. There is no sound. There is no time. There is only the darkness. And then, slowly, the first frame of the film begins to play. I'm back in the theater. I'm back where it all began, sitting in the front row, staring at the screen. But it's different now. The seats are filled, but not with people. With shadows. With versions of me. I can see them all. They're all around me, sitting quietly, waiting. And I know what they are. They are me. They always have been. The film continues to play, and I am part of it now. The camera moves down the dark alley, the figures frozen, staring at the screen. But I am in that alley now. I am one of them. I feel the cold of the night, the quiet of the city, and I know that the story is repeating. It's never going to stop. The whispers, the footsteps, the figures, they are all part of the loop. They are all part of me. The film loops endlessly, replaying over and over again, and I know that I will always be here, in the darkness, in the cold, in the seat with the others. Watching. Waiting. Forever. I am the film now. I am its soul. Its curse. And the cycle will never end. It will never end. Have you ever wondered what lies just beyond the mirror? Not the reflection we know, but one that shows our face, but something else, something darker, deeper? That's the question that haunts me now. It all began when I found the mirror. It wasn't a special mirror. In fact, it seemed like something anyone could overlook. I had recently moved into an old house, one that creaked and groaned like it was alive. It had a musty smell, like dust and old wood. The kind of house you wouldn't visit unless you had no other choice. It wasn't the house that bothered me, it was the basement. Something about it felt wrong, like it was hiding something. The air down there was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on you. The steps creaked under my feet as I descended into the darkness, my flashlight the only thing standing between me and the unknown. I wasn't looking for anything when I first noticed it. I had been sifting through some old boxes, discarded furniture, and forgotten relics of the house's past life. Then, almost as if it had been waiting for me, I saw it, an old, oval-shaped mirror leaning against the far wall. Its surface was cracked in places, but the frame was intricately carved, delicate. It wasn't large, but it stood out against the piles of junk around it. I wasn't sure why I was drawn to it. Maybe it was the way the mirror caught the dim light, or maybe it was the curiosity that lingered in me, the same curiosity that had already led me deeper into the house than I had intended. I reached for it without thinking. The moment my fingers brushed the glass, I felt it. A cold, sharp sensation that made my skin crawl. For a second, I thought it was just the chill of the basement, but no, it was something else. Something far colder. The air shifted and the flashlight flickered. I stepped back, heart racing, but I couldn't pull myself away. My eyes locked on the reflection in the mirror, and what I saw wasn't me. At least, not exactly. The reflection was distorted, twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't the basement I saw behind me, not the piles of junk or the dimly lit walls. Instead, it was a place far darker, an empty street lined with crumbling buildings, covered in shadow. There were no lights, no movement. Just darkness, stretching on endlessly. But the most unsettling thing wasn't the place. It was the figure standing at the end of the street. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel it staring at me, its presence heavy, suffocating. I couldn't look away. A sound, faint, barely audible, came from the mirror, a soft rustling noise that grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I stepped back, my breath quickening, but the figure in the reflection remained unmoving. I wanted to turn away, to walk back upstairs and forget the mirror, but something held me there. It was as though the mirror had reached out and anchored me, pulling me into its depths. The figure in the reflection was no longer standing still. It was moving toward me, slowly at first, but the movement was unmistakable. I could hear its footsteps now, slow, deliberate, as though it was making its way toward the glass. It wasn't until the figure was only a few feet away, its face still obscured in darkness, that I realized the truth. It wasn't just a reflection. It was a gateway. I turned away from the mirror then, stumbling back in a panic, but something pulled at me. I felt it, a tug, deep inside me, as though the mirror was trying to pull me back. I resisted, forcing my legs to carry me toward the stairs, out of the basement, away from that thing that had begun to stir. But as I reached the top of the stairs, something stopped me. A soft creak, like a whisper, came from below. I glanced down, and for the briefest moment, I saw the reflection in the basement mirror again. This time, the figure's face was clearer. Not completely, but enough that I could see its eyes. Dark, hollow eyes, staring right at me. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, my breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The figure, it was still there. I could feel it, watching me. And it wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It had crossed into my world. It started subtly. A shift in the air, like a draft you can't quite explain. I thought I was just imagining things. The house was old, creaky floors, rattling windows, the kind of things that make you question if you're really alone. But then, the whispers began. I didn't hear them clearly at first, just a soft murmur in the distance. At night, when the house grew silent, I could almost make out words. But they were faint, distorted, like a voice just out of reach. I chalked it up to stress, to the strange feeling the house gave me. After all, I had just moved in, and living alone in a place this old can play tricks on your mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was the cause of it. That night, after I had slammed the basement door shut, I stayed awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of the figure. Its hollow eyes haunted me, its presence so real, so palpable. I kept hearing that soft rustling noise from below, as if something, or someone, was moving around the basement. The next morning, I tried to forget about it. I told myself that it was just a trick of the mind, that I had imagined the whole thing. But as the days passed, things grew stranger. I began to notice little things. My reflection in the bathroom mirror would seem just a second too slow, as if it was lagging behind my movements. I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, just out of focus, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was following me, that something was always just behind me, waiting. The whispers grew louder. They were no longer faint murmurs, but distinct voices, each one speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and the whispers would stop the moment I opened my eyes. But the silence felt wrong, unnatural. Then came the footsteps. At first, it was just a single step, like a distant echo from downstairs. I thought I had imagined it, or maybe it was the house settling. But over the next few days, the footsteps became more frequent, more deliberate. They started to follow me, always just behind, always just out of sight. I would turn corners, expecting to see something, or someone, but the hallway would be empty. One evening, I could stand it no longer. I had to go back down to the basement, to the mirror. Maybe I was going mad, or maybe there was something in that reflection that I needed to understand. Something that had crossed over. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I descended the stairs slowly, the old wood creaking beneath my weight. The basement was as cold as ever, the smell of mildew and decay hanging in the air. My heart raced as I approached the mirror. It was still there, leaning against the wall, its surface cracked, but the reflection, it wasn't the same as before. I could still see the empty street in the reflection, but now it was darker, more oppressive. The buildings were not just crumbling, they were collapsing, disintegrating, as though the very air was eroding them away. The figure was still there, standing in the same place. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. I could see its shape more clearly, and it was no longer a silhouette in the shadows. It had form. I could make out limbs, but there was something wrong with them. Distorted, twisted, like they didn't belong in the world. The whispering came again, louder this time, like a chorus of voices rising from the depths of the reflection. Come closer. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The figure's head tilted, its hollow eyes narrowing as it looked directly at me. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the air grow heavier, thicker, as though the walls were closing in. I wanted to back away, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the mirror had a hold on me now, drawing me closer. Come closer, it repeated, this time not from the reflection, but from somewhere behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. The basement was empty. I took a step back, my legs trembling, but then I heard it. The footsteps, louder now, closer. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just up the stairs, out of the basement, away from that mirror. My feet pounded against the floor, but the footsteps behind me kept pace, faster now, more urgent. They were closing in. I felt a pressure on my chest, like a weight, like something was pushing me forward, urging me to keep moving. But when I reached the top of the stairs, I saw it. The figure. It was there, standing in the hallway, blocking my path. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Its eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, locked onto mine. It was no longer just a reflection. It was here, in my world. I could feel it, could sense its presence, suffocating me, surrounding me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing for a way out, but the figure didn't move. It stood there, watching me, waiting. And then, without warning, I felt something cold, sharp, wrap around my ankle. It was like a hand, but not human, twisted and claw-like, dragging me toward it. You're ours now, the voice whispered, the chorus of voices growing louder, more insistent. I tried to scream, to pull away, but the grip tightened, pulling me into the darkness. The figure moved closer, its face now fully visible, and I saw it. A face not made of flesh, but of shadows, shifting mass of darkness, its eyes the only thing solid in the void. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't escape. And then, everything went black. The last thing I heard was the sound of the mirror cracking. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I was back in my bedroom, in my bed. The room was bathed in the soft light of early morning, and for a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I felt the chill in the air, the same coldness that had crept into my bones last night. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, like it didn't belong to me anymore. My limbs were stiff, as though they had been asleep for far too long. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fog, but the weight in my chest didn't lift. The whispers, they were gone, but something was wrong. The silence felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I forced myself out of bed and stumbled to the mirror across the room. The reflection staring back at me seemed off, just a little. I wasn't sure what it was at first. My hair was messier than usual, my clothes slightly wrinkled, but there was something more. A subtle distortion, like the image wasn't quite lining up with the reality in front of me. I leaned closer to the mirror, trying to focus, but the air around me seemed to ripple, like the glass was alive. My reflection blurred for a second, and I could see a flash of someone moving behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. Silent. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking. I needed to calm down. But my feet were already moving, pulling me towards the door. I had to know. I had to go back down to the basement, to the mirror. It was the only thing that made sense, the only way to understand what was happening. I descended the stairs again, the cold air greeting me like an old friend. The basement was darker than I remembered, as though it had deepened overnight. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step a reminder that something was wrong, something was waiting. When I reached the bottom, I could see it again. The mirror. But now it was different. It wasn't leaning against the wall like before. It was standing upright, as if it had always been there, waiting for me to return. I approached it slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around, to leave, to forget about the mirror. But I couldn't. My body moved of its own accord, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. The reflection wasn't just a distorted version of the basement. It was alive. The space inside the mirror stretched and twisted, as though it was part of a different world, a world that was now spilling out into mine. The buildings from the other side of the mirror were now clearer, more defined, but they were wrong, their angles too sharp, their walls shifting, breathing in a way they shouldn't. It looked like a city, but it wasn't a city I recognized. The air was thick, the sky an unnatural shade of gray, the ground cracked and broken. But there, at the far end of the reflection, stood the figure. It was no longer standing still. It was moving, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by some unseen hand. I couldn't look away. It wasn't the same as before. This time, it saw me. Its head tilted, its eyes, those deep, hollow eyes, staring directly at me, as if it knew everything about me. As if it knew what I was about to do. A soft rustling noise came from the mirror, like clothes brushing against each other. Then, I heard a voice. A voice that was not my own, not the voices from the basement or the whispers in the night. Come. It wasn't a word, but a command, a pull that resonated deep inside me. My legs moved before I could stop them, dragging me closer to the glass. It was as if the world around me was fading, the basement shrinking away until there was only the mirror, and the figure, and the deep, endless void behind it. Come, the voice repeated, and I felt my feet step forward, the glass cool against my skin as I reached out, trembling. But something inside me, a small, fading part of me, screamed for me to stop. I yanked my hand back, stumbling away from the mirror, but it was no use. The room was shifting, bending, as if the lines between reality and the reflection were beginning to blur. I turned, desperate to escape, but the basement door was gone. The stairs had disappeared, and in their place was the same twisted reflection of the city, the figure now closer, its form becoming more solid with each passing second. The whispers began again, louder now, surrounding me. The sound of footsteps, hundreds of them, echoing from the other side of the mirror, growing louder, faster, until they were right behind me. I spun around, and there, standing in the doorway of the basement, was the figure. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was flesh, a grotesque mockery of a person, its body writhing, shifting, its face still hidden in darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me. "You've crossed the threshold," it whispered, its voice a low growl, not from its mouth, but from somewhere deep within my mind. "Now you belong here." I backed away, heart racing, but the figure moved, its legs twisting, its body contorting unnaturally as it advanced. I ran, but the room was changing with every step. The walls were no longer solid. They bent and rippled, folding into themselves as though the house itself was breaking apart. I could hear the whispers, the footsteps, closing in on me from all directions. I didn't know how to escape. There was nowhere to run. The figure reached out a hand, long, twisted fingers that stretched toward me like claws. And just as I thought I would be caught, I felt something shift. The world around me seemed to fracture, the air bending and warping, and for a brief moment I was weightless, floating between realities. And then the mirror shattered. In that moment, everything went silent. The whispers, the footsteps, the figure, they all vanished. I was back in the basement. The air was still, thick with the smell of dust and decay. The mirror was gone, but I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel it, the pull, the weight of that other world lingering in the back of my mind. The house was silent, but I knew. The mirror hadn't just been a portal. It had been a warning. And whatever I had unleashed, it was coming for me. I stood there, frozen in the basement, my breath shallow, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The mirror was gone, shattered beyond recognition. But something else was there, a weight, a presence that pressed down on my chest. The silence of the house seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy that I couldn't explain. I forced myself to move, my feet heavy as I climbed the stairs. Every step felt like an effort, as though the air around me was thicker now, more oppressive. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway. The house seemed the same, normal, quiet, but I knew it wasn't. I knew something had changed. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a place that didn't belong in this world. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of my vision made my pulse spike. It was as if the house was alive now, as if the walls themselves were watching me. I went to the living room and sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. The events of the last few days, no, weeks, had blurred together in a haze of fear and confusion. What had I seen? What had that thing been? The figure. I could still see it in my mind, its twisted form, its eyes, empty, yet full of malice. The mirror hadn't just shown me another world. It had shown me something that had crossed into mine, something that wasn't bound by the rules of our reality. And now, I could feel it. It was here. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the fear was still lingering. But it was more than that. I could hear it, soft at first, like a faint scratching sound, coming from somewhere deep in the house. My heart began to race again, and I stood, my legs shaking. The noise grew louder, closer, like something was moving through the walls, creeping toward me. It's just the house settling, I told myself, forcing myself to move towards the source of the sound. I walked slowly toward the hallway, my breath caught in my throat. As I reached the corner, the scratching stopped. I stood still, listening, but the house was silent again. Then, I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the door to the basement, the shadows shifted. It was a fleeting movement, barely noticeable, but I knew what I had seen. Someone was standing there, watching me. I took a step forward, my hand outstretched toward the door. The air grew colder, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. The figure didn't move. I didn't want to go closer. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet were rooted to the floor. I had to know what it was. I took another step. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, a sharp sound that made me jump. The door to the basement slammed shut, rattling the walls. I turned toward it, but there was no one there. The scratching sound began again, louder now, almost frantic. It was coming from the basement, from inside the walls. I didn't hesitate this time. I bolted down the hallway towards the basement door. But when I reached for the handle, I stopped. The door wasn't just locked, it was sealed. A strange, dark substance oozed from the edges, as though the house itself was trying to keep me out, or perhaps keep something in. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. The scratching continued, now joined by a low, guttural growl. Something was down there, and it was angry. I backed away, my mind spinning with terror. What had I done? What had I unleashed when I opened that mirror? I turned to leave the hallway, but when I looked down the stairs, my eyes widened in horror. The figure was there again, standing at the bottom of the steps, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, its empty eyes fixed on me. It moved slowly, its body contorting in ways that were impossible, as though it was coming from a place where the laws of nature no longer applied. The growling grew louder, more intense. It was coming from the figure. I could hear it now, feel the vibrations in the floor beneath my feet. It wasn't just angry. It was hungry. And then it spoke. "You can't run anymore." The voice was deep, guttural, like it came from the pit of some dark abyss. It was a voice I recognized, one I had heard from the mirror. It was its voice, the one that had called me. I turned and ran, not caring where I went, not caring if I made noise or if I crashed into furniture. I needed to get away, needed to escape the house, but it felt like the house itself was fighting me. I reached the front door and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the inside, as if it had been sealed shut to keep me in. I looked behind me, and there it was again, the figure. It had moved so quickly, so silently, that I didn't hear it coming. It was closer now, its face visible, twisted with hunger, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. I heard the whispers again, louder now, surrounding me from all sides. "You're ours." The walls seemed to close in. The room shifted, bending in on itself. The house was no longer just a house. It was a prison, a trap, a living thing that was swallowing me whole. I needed to leave. I needed to escape. But I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping this. The figure moved toward me, its limbs stretching farther than they should. Its eyes burned into me, its mouth opening wider, and then, in a voice that was not its own, it whispered, "You belong to us now." And then everything went black. I woke with a jolt, my body stiff, my breath shallow. The darkness around me was oppressive, thick like a heavy blanket pressing against my chest. I could feel the cold on my skin, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep through the very fabric of my being. I sat up, disoriented, and immediately regretted the movement. My head swam, the world around me spinning. The room was completely black, as if all light had been swallowed whole. The faint sounds of my breath and heartbeat were the only things I could hear, amplified in the silence. I tried to move, but something stopped me. My hands were tied. No, restrained. Cold metal chains were wrapped around my wrists, clinking together with each small movement I made. Panic surged in my chest, and I tried to pull away, but the chains held me fast. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of my surroundings. It was then that I noticed the air was wrong. It felt too thick, too heavy, like something was pressing down on me from all sides. The very atmosphere seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, the air vibrating with a low, guttural sound like distant growls. I could hear them again. The whispers. Soft, ethereal, just beyond the edge of my hearing. They weren't coming from the mirror anymore. They were coming from inside the walls, from the very space around me. The figure. The thing that had haunted me. It was no longer a distant presence. It was here. It was inside. I was in some kind of room, though the details were hard to discern in the thick darkness. The walls were cold stone, jagged and uneven. I could feel their rough texture under my fingertips as I tried to move, to stand. But as soon as I tried to push myself up, I felt a pull, a force pulling me back down to the floor. I strained against the chains, but they were unyielding. There was no escape. I was trapped. And then, from the far corner of the room, I saw something. A faint, flickering light, like a candle, small and unsteady. It was just enough to make out a figure standing in the shadows. My pulse quickened as the figure stepped into the dim light, its shape familiar. It was the figure. The same twisted, grotesque form that had followed me, that had haunted me. But now, it was different. It was more solid, more real. Its eyes were wide open, black as pits, and the grin that spread across its face seemed too wide, too unnatural. It took a step forward, its limbs jerking in that same unnatural, twisted way. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if it was savoring my fear. "Welcome," it said, its voice a dark rasp that scraped against my ears. "You've been chosen." My throat tightened. I wanted to scream, to shout, but the words wouldn't come. Fear had a grip on me so tight that I could barely breathe, let alone speak. "You thought you could escape," it continued, its form drawing closer. "But you can't. This world, this place, it's ours now. And you are part of it." I felt the weight of its gaze on me, the suffocating pressure of its presence. My body trembled as the chains rattled, desperate to break free. But it was no use. The figure was in control now. "You belong here," it whispered, the words slipping into my mind like poison. "You are part of the reflection now. The mirror has taken you. You can never leave." Suddenly, I felt a pull on my chest, a sharp tug that made my whole body jerk. I gasped, my head spinning, as though something was reaching inside me, pulling at my very soul. The chains rattled violently as if they were alive, constricting around my wrists. And then I saw it. The mirror. It was standing before me, though I had no idea how it had come to be there. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was a door, a portal between worlds. The glass shimmered with an eerie glow, the surface swirling and warping like liquid. I could see the other side. The same twisted city, the same dark, unnatural sky. The figure was standing inside the mirror, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. "You are mine now," it said, its voice louder, more powerful, as it reached out from the glass. The fingers were stretching, impossibly long, ready to pull me into the darkness. I tried to scream, to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen, my limbs heavy, unable to escape the grasp of the thing in front of me. The mirror. The mirror was the key. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a gateway, a rift between worlds. And I had crossed it. I had opened it. The figure in the mirror smiled, its mouth splitting wider and wider. The growl came again, this time deafening, filling the room with its horrific resonance. The shadows in the room deepened, closing in on me as the figure's hand reached through the mirror, its fingers curling toward me. I could feel the cold, the sharpness of its touch before it even made contact. The mirror's surface rippled, like water, and the air around me thickened, pressing down on me from all sides. The walls of the room seemed to twist, the boundaries between this world and the mirror's world blurring, warping. Reality itself was collapsing. And then, with a final, crushing force, the mirror shattered. The room went dark. The whispers stopped. The cold disappeared. And everything was still. But even in the silence, I could feel it. The pull. The weight of the other side. It was still there, waiting. And I was still part of it. I had never left. I had only changed. And the mirror would always be there, its shattered pieces scattered throughout the darkness, waiting for someone else to find it. And when they did, they, too, would belong to the other side. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night with a song stuck in your head? A melody you can't explain, one that feels familiar and foreign at the same time? I have. Every single night. It starts softly at first, like a distant hum, and then grows louder, clearer. It's always the same. The melody. It plays only in my dreams, a haunting tune that wraps around my mind like smoke, gentle but persistent. For years, I thought nothing of it. It was just a dream, after all. A figment of my subconscious, a random pattern of notes that my brain had created. Nothing special. But I never could shake the feeling that there was more to it. A deeper meaning hidden beneath the notes. Each night, the melody would begin as I drifted off to sleep. In the dream world, it was beautiful, peaceful even. But as time passed, it began to change. The notes twisted, darkened, until they no longer sounded like music at all. It was like the song was trying to tell me something, a warning, perhaps, but I could never quite understand what. Then one night, something changed. I was walking through my apartment, getting ready for bed. The lights flickered for a moment, and then I heard it. The melody. But it wasn't in my head this time. It was real. It was coming from somewhere, from somewhere else. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that the sound was just a trick my mind was playing on me. But no! It was real. It echoed through the walls of my apartment, clear as day. A soft, eerie tune that carried with it a strange weight. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The melody was unmistakable. The same notes, the same rhythm, the same haunting tune I had heard so many times before in my dreams. Only this time, it wasn't a dream. It was real. I rushed to the window, peering out into the street below. But the world was silent, still. The city that never sleeps had suddenly fallen into an eerie hush. The melody was the only sound. I don't know how long I stood there, listening. I could hear the distant hum of traffic, the faint murmur of people, but the song remained at the forefront of my mind, overpowering everything else. It was like the entire world had faded away, and all that was left was that tune, that insistent, haunting melody. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself it was nothing, just some random noise I was hearing, something my mind had conjured up. But then, it happened again. I heard it, clear as day. And this time, it was coming from the other room. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My heart raced, thudding louder in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. The melody seemed to be pulling me, calling me, drawing me toward it. It was coming from the hallway. Slowly, my feet moved, almost against my will. The apartment was still, far too still. The soft hum of the song was the only thing I could hear now. I couldn't explain it, but somehow, I knew that the melody was more than just music. It was something else. Something ancient. I took a step into the hallway, and the song seemed to grow louder, closer. But there was nothing there. No one. Nothing but empty space. I walked to the end of the hall, where my bedroom door stood slightly ajar. The melody was coming from inside. I hesitated for a moment. I wanted to turn back, but my legs moved on their own. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, but the melody, it was clear now. Right there, in the center of the room. But there was nothing. No instrument, no source. Just the melody, ringing in the air like a ghost. I stood frozen, my skin crawling with unease. There was something about it, something wrong. The song was pulling at something inside me, something I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the air grew colder. The melody seemed to twist, distorting itself, like it was changing. The notes turned darker, sharper. It sounded almost like a warning. And that's when I felt it. The shift. The air around me began to change. I could feel it in my bones, in my very soul. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the melody, the floor beneath my feet vibrating with each note. It was like the entire apartment was alive, breathing, moving with the music. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't just a song anymore. It was something far more dangerous. Something that didn't belong in this world. The melody didn't stop. It never stopped. And as I stood there, in the silence of my room, the song began to take shape, no longer just a sound, but a presence. A force. And I realized, with growing horror, that it wasn't just calling me. It was calling for something else. The night didn't feel like night anymore. It was as though the world had shifted, folding into something I couldn't understand. The melody, still echoing through the walls, seemed to take on a life of its own, its rhythm bending and warping as it filled the room. My heart was pounding, my skin prickling, but I couldn't move. I stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the music came from, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The song seemed to hold me in place, wrapping around me like invisible chains. It was soothing, in a way, but also terrifying. The haunting notes seeped into my thoughts, filling every crevice of my mind, drawing out all logic and reason. I wasn't alone in that room anymore. I could feel it. The air had changed, thickened, like something was just beyond my reach, hiding in the shadows. I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. Then, the melody stopped. Silence. The sudden stillness was almost worse than the song itself. The quiet pressed against my ears, like a weight I couldn't lift. My thoughts, frantic and wild, seemed to echo louder in the absence of sound. But it wasn't true silence. No, something else had taken its place. I could hear footsteps. I turned, but there was nothing. No one. The room was as empty as before, save for the faintest sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and growing closer. The sound came from the hallway, not from inside the room, but it was clear now. The rhythm of the footsteps matched the melody that had played moments before, as though they were part of the same song. I took a step back, my breath shallow, my body trembling. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct. I could hear them on the wooden floor outside the room, slow and steady. Each step made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to scream again, but the sound seemed to be swallowed by the air, as if the room itself was conspiring against me. I moved to the door, my hand reaching for the handle. But before I could grasp it, the door swung open by itself. The hallway beyond was dark, but the sound of those footsteps, they were closer now, just outside. I hesitated, staring into the blackness. The hallway stretched out before me, too long and too quiet. I couldn't see anything beyond the first few steps, but I knew that something was waiting out there. The footsteps stopped. I felt a chill sweep over me, colder than anything I'd ever felt. The air seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't explain. I tried to step back into the room, but my feet wouldn't move. The floor was sticky with dread, as though the ground itself was holding me in place. Then, the air shifted again. A shadow. A figure. It was faint at first, barely visible in the dark, but it grew clearer with each passing second. A shape. A person, standing just at the edge of the hallway, their back to me. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel their presence. It was as if the figure was waiting for me. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was trapped, held by some invisible force. The melody started again, softly at first, like a whisper, and the figure in the hallway seemed to react to it. It tilted its head, almost like it was listening, too. Then, without warning, the figure turned. I couldn't see its face, but I felt the stare, cold and piercing, like the eyes of something that wasn't entirely human. A shiver ran down my spine as it took a step forward, and then another. Its movements were slow, deliberate, but its presence was overwhelming. I wanted to run, but the door wouldn't open, and my legs wouldn't move. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. The song told me everything I needed to know. It was a call to something else. The figure took another step forward, its feet barely making a sound on the floor. The room seemed to contract around me, suffocating. The melody grew louder, more insistent, as if urging me to follow. I couldn't look away. I couldn't breathe. It stopped just inside the doorway, standing still, waiting. The air in the room felt thick, like time itself was bending, slowing down. I could feel the pressure of the world pushing against me, all of it funneled into this one moment. And then, with a voice like crackling static, the figure spoke. "You've heard the song, haven't you?" I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth was dry, my throat tight. The figure didn't wait for an answer. "You're not meant to hear it," it continued, its voice low and distorted. But now you do. I didn't understand. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, of terror, but one thing was clear: whatever this figure was, it wasn't human. It wasn't something that belonged in my world. The melody continued to play, twisting and turning in the background, a faint but constant pulse in the air. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back into the darkness. The door slammed shut, and the music, it stopped. I stood there, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was silent again. But I knew it wasn't over. It had only just begun. Something had changed. And now, I couldn't escape it. The song had opened a door to a place that didn't exist. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The silence was deafening, and even though the figure had vanished, I could feel its presence lingering in the corners of my mind like a shadow that refused to leave. The air in my apartment was thick, almost suffocating, and no matter how many lights I turned on, it never seemed bright enough. The darkness had seeped into my bones, and I was certain it would never leave. The next morning, I tried to go about my day, convincing myself that everything was fine, that I had simply imagined it all. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The song, the figure, they weren't just in my head, they were real. And they were waiting for me. As I moved through my apartment, I noticed that things seemed off. Small things at first. A picture frame askew, a drawer that wasn't quite closed. But the longer I looked, the more I realized the apartment had changed. It was subtle, but undeniable. The walls seemed closer, the rooms smaller. The hallway felt longer, as though it stretched farther than it had before. And then it happened again. The melody. It started softly, almost like a distant hum at the edge of my consciousness. My heart skipped a beat, and my skin prickled with a sudden chill. The song, so familiar yet so foreign, crept into my ears, wrapping itself around my thoughts like a vine, tightening with every note. I froze, standing still in the middle of the living room. The song had returned, just like before, but this time it was different. It wasn't coming from the hallway, from the darkness. No, this time it was coming from within the walls, from the very foundation of the building itself. It was as if the apartment itself was alive, breathing in time with the music. My pulse quickened, and I could feel my body tense, every muscle screaming for me to run. But I couldn't move. I couldn't tear myself away from the sound. It was as though this song had a hold on me, pulling me in, drawing me closer to something I didn't understand. And then I heard it. A whisper, faint at first, but growing louder. A voice, distorted and unrecognizable, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. I turned toward the hallway, my legs shaking, my heart racing. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the song, and I felt as though the very space around me was warping, shifting, like reality itself was bending to the melody. The whispering grew clearer, and I realized it was speaking directly to me. "You shouldn't have listened," it said, the voice warped and broken, like it was coming from somewhere deep beneath the earth. "Now you belong." I didn't understand. My mind was a haze of panic, and every fiber of my being screamed for me to escape. But the song was growing louder now, more insistent. It was everywhere, inside me, outside me, pulling at the very fabric of my reality. Without thinking, I turned and ran for the door. But as my hand reached for the handle, the door, it wouldn't open. It was as if the apartment had become a prison, trapping me inside. I twisted the handle, pulling with all my strength, but it was useless. The door wouldn't budge. The song was no longer just music. It was a force, a presence that filled the space around me, suffocating me, pulling at my sanity. And I could hear it now, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the footsteps again. The same slow, deliberate steps from the hallway. Closer now. Closer than before. I spun around, my pulse racing, but the hallway was empty. There was nothing there. But I knew that something was coming. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, creeping across the walls like dark tendrils. The temperature dropped, and my breath came out in sharp, visible gasps. It was freezing now, as if winter had suddenly descended upon me. The footsteps stopped, and for a brief, horrible moment, everything was still. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my ears, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then it came. The door to the closet in the corner of the living room creaked open. I didn't move. I couldn't. It was as if my body had shut down, unable to react, trapped in the unrelenting grip of the melody. The figure emerged from the closet. It was the same shape, the same presence, but this time it was different. The darkness seemed to cling to it, swirling around its form like it wasn't entirely of this world. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and as it stepped into the room, the walls seemed to close in around me. I could see it now. The figure's face, or what should have been its face, was featureless, smooth and blank, like a void staring back at me. It moved closer, and with each step, the room seemed to warp, stretching and bending in impossible ways. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice was gone, and my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, unable to escape. The figure reached out with a hand, long, unnaturally long, and touched my arm. The moment it made contact, the world around me shattered. I was no longer in my apartment. The melody, the darkness, the figure, it all faded away, replaced by something else. A vast, empty space filled with a cold, suffocating silence. And there, in the distance, I could see it, the door. A doorway, flickering in the dark like a dying light. It was calling to me. It wasn't the song that had brought me here. No. The melody had only been the beginning. The door was the end. And I knew, deep down, that I was meant to walk through it. I stood frozen, staring at the flickering doorway in the distance. The melody had stopped, but its eerie presence lingered, like a hum beneath my skin. The vast, empty space around me felt infinite, stretching endlessly in all directions. There were no walls, no floor, just a cold, suffocating void. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, pulling me deeper into this unfamiliar, unnatural place. The figure, the thing that had emerged from my closet, was gone, leaving only its absence behind. But I could feel it watching me, just beyond my perception, lurking in the shadows of my mind. Its presence was a constant, an oppressive force that never let me forget what I had just encountered. The door. It stood before me, flickering in the darkness, its outline shimmering like a mirage. I felt a compulsion, an irresistible pull toward it, as though it held the answers to everything, as though it was the only way out. But deep down, a small part of me knew that it wasn't an escape. It was a choice, one I wasn't sure I should make. I took a step forward, and the silence around me seemed to swallow the sound of my footsteps. The air grew colder, and the darkness pressed in, but I couldn't stop myself. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the space around me was fighting to hold me back. But I couldn't turn away. Not now. The door was close now, so close I could almost reach out and touch it. The light it emitted was dim, but it had a strange, otherworldly glow, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. I could feel the weight of its presence, like it was alive, waiting for me. And with every step I took, the air grew thicker, more oppressive, like the very fabric of reality was unraveling around me. I was almost there. My hand reached out, trembling, and I placed it on the handle. It was ice cold, colder than anything I had ever felt before, sending a shock of fear through my body. But still, I didn't stop. I turned the handle and pulled the door open. The world on the other side was not what I expected. It wasn't a bright, welcoming space, nor was it a continuation of the void I had just left. No, it was something else entirely. The room beyond the door was small, cramped, and dimly lit by a single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with dust and debris. It looked like a forgotten attic, a place left untouched for years. But what caught my attention were the objects scattered around the room. Furniture. Old, worn furniture, covered in sheets that had long since yellowed with age. Chairs, a table, a bookshelf, all of them out of place, as if they didn't belong in this strange, empty world. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and every step I took sent a cloud of dust swirling around me. I didn't understand. This wasn't what I had expected. Where was I? What was this place? I had crossed through the door, but nothing felt real. Nothing felt right. And then I heard it. The song. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, growing stronger with every passing second, just like it had in my apartment. But this time, it wasn't just a melody. It was a voice. A voice calling me. Come closer. The words were soft, almost gentle, but there was an undeniable urgency in them. A force behind them that made my heart race. I hesitated, standing at the threshold of the room, torn between the impulse to run and the pull to step forward. But before I could make a decision, something shifted in the room. The furniture, those old, forgotten pieces, began to move. At first, it was just a small twitch, the chairs scraping against the floor as though they were shifting on their own. But then, they moved more deliberately. The chairs turned, facing me. The table seemed to slide forward, and the bookshelf tilted, the books spilling out onto the floor like a flood. The room, it was alive. I wanted to turn and run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the melody, by the eerie movements of the room. The song was louder now, almost deafening, and the voice was no longer just a whisper. It was clear, unmistakable. Join us, it said. And then, in the center of the room, a shape began to emerge. The figure, the same one I had seen before, the one with the featureless face, stepped out from behind the furniture. Its movements were slow, deliberate, but there was no mistaking the hunger in its presence. It was coming for me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but the room seemed to shrink around me. The walls closed in, and the door, my only escape, had disappeared. There was no way out now. The figure reached out with its long, bony fingers, and the music swelled to a crescendo, vibrating through my very bones. I was drowning in it, suffocating under its weight. I could feel it pulling me closer, dragging me toward the center of the room where the figure waited. And then, the song changed. It shifted, becoming something darker, more insistent. The voice now carried a promise, one I couldn't escape. Your soul is ours. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the music, lost in the cold, suffocating air. The figure's hand touched my shoulder, and the world around me shattered once more. And I was falling through the dark, falling into the unknown, into a place where time had no meaning and the very essence of reality had been twisted beyond recognition. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was the melody, now a haunting lullaby, echoing in the void. And then, nothing. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in my apartment. But it was different. The walls were closer, the air heavier. And in the distance, I could hear it again, the song. It was playing, faint but persistent, as if it had never stopped. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that I had never truly left. I was still on the other side. And it was waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. My head spun, disoriented and lost in the muffled fog of sleep and reality, blending in ways I couldn't comprehend. The melody, that haunting, twisting song, filled the air around me, soft at first, like a whisper in the background, but growing louder, heavier, until it was all I could hear. It seemed to seep into every corner of my apartment, filling every space, every moment, like a flood filling a room. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. I was back in my apartment. I was sure of it. But everything was wrong. The walls were closer than before, the shadows too deep, the silence too heavy. I could feel the weight of the room pressing in on me, as if the very air had become thicker, harder to move through. I was still trapped, and the melody, the song, was still here. I stumbled to my feet, heart pounding in my chest. I felt cold, the chill seeping into my bones as I stumbled toward the hallway. My hands shook as I gripped the doorknob, but the moment I turned it, I was met with nothing, just empty space. The hallway beyond was gone, as if it had never been there. The door led to nothing, just the same suffocating void from before. The walls seemed to close in around me, pulling in from every side, as if the apartment was shrinking. The floor beneath my feet creaked and groaned in protest, and I could swear I felt the entire structure shifting, the foundation cracking. And through it all, the song. The melody continued to play, its notes creeping into the corners of my mind, turning into whispers that I couldn't escape. Come back, the voice called, softer now, almost tender, as though coaxing me into a forgotten dream. You belong here. I backed away from the door, my breath quickening. I had to escape. I had to get out. But how? I turned to the window. Maybe I could break through, leap out into the world beyond, anything to escape this nightmare. But as I reached the glass, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Outside, there was no world. The city I had known, my home, the streets, the buildings, had vanished. There was nothing but darkness. A deep, endless void stretching out as far as the eye could see, and in the distance, faint flashes of light that flickered in rhythm with the melody. It was as if the world itself had been swallowed by the song, consumed by it. And I realized with dawning horror that I was no longer in my apartment. I was somewhere else. I turned around, feeling trapped, desperate. The walls were closing in faster now, the room distorting as the shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally across the floor. The furniture, those pieces that hadn't been here moments before, shifted again, moving toward me with a slow, deliberate crawl. And in the center of the room, the door, the only door I could see, appeared. It was not the door I had come through. This was something new, something wrong. The handle twisted and turned of its own accord, and the hinges groaned in the silence. The music, now a violent crescendo, crashed against my ears, demanding my attention, pulling me closer to the door. I didn't want to go through it. I didn't want to step into the unknown, into the void beyond, but I knew I had no choice. This place, this twisted, dreamlike world, was not my reality anymore. It was a prison, a nightmare from which there was no waking. I walked toward the door, each step a struggle against the pull of the song, against the creeping cold that wrapped itself around me like chains. My fingers brushed the cold, metallic handle, and for a moment, I hesitated. The whispers were louder now, clearer. The voice, the same voice I had heard over and over again, echoed in my ears. You are one of us. The words felt like they were seeping into my skin, filling my lungs with cold, empty air. The music rose again, louder than before, until it was all I could hear, all I could feel. I opened the door, stepping through without thinking, without looking back. And I fell. The world around me spun as I tumbled through endless space, time stretching and twisting like a rubber band about to snap. I could hear the song beneath me, pulling me deeper, further into the void. And then, the darkness swallowed me whole. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing on the same floor. The same apartment. The same furniture. The same walls. Everything was the same. But nothing was right. The song had stopped. The silence was suffocating. And as I looked around, I realized that I was no longer alone. The figure from before, the faceless one, stood in the center of the room, watching me with its endless, empty gaze. And I knew then that there was no escape. This place, this realm, it wasn't just a dream. It was real. And I had crossed over. The figure raised a hand, and the shadows around me deepened, twisting into shapes that were almost human, almost familiar. I could feel the presence of something else, something watching me, just beyond my vision. It was waiting for me to acknowledge it. It was waiting for me to join it. The melody began again, faint at first, but rising, filling the room with its insistent, all-consuming tune. And I realized that the door I had crossed through, if it had ever been a door, was gone. There was no way back. Welcome home, the voice whispered. And for the first time, I understood the truth. There was no waking from this. I was trapped, lost in the melody, forever bound to this place, a place where time no longer had meaning, where reality itself was a fleeting memory. And this song would never stop playing. It would never stop calling me. And I would never escape. I had become part of it. And the doors to this world, this other side, would open for anyone who dared to listen. Forever. Have you ever had the feeling that someone was watching you, even when you were alone? That strange, unsettling sensation that comes when you hear something, but you know you're the only one in the room? It's like your mind is playing tricks on you, or maybe there's something more to it. That was the question I found myself asking one night. It had started with a faint sound, a soft shuffling noise, like someone walking around. At first, I thought it was nothing. The building was old, after all. Pipes creaked, floors groaned, and the walls seemed to hum with every step I took. But then, it happened again. And again. Every night, the sounds came from the apartment next to mine. But here's the thing, the apartment had been empty for months. I knew because I'd seen the notice on the door. The place had been up for rent, but no one had moved in. There had been no new tenants, no visitors, no sign of life. Yet the sounds persisted. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe it was just the building settling, I told myself. But then, as the nights wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was the way the sounds moved, always at night, always when the world outside was still. A faint scratching at the walls, a low creak of floorboards, a distant thump that seemed to echo down the hallway. I had become so familiar with the noises that I could recognize their rhythm. And every time they started, my pulse would quicken. My skin would crawl. One evening, unable to take it anymore, I decided to investigate. I stood in the hallway outside the door to the apartment. The hallway was dimly lit, the yellowish glow of the flickering bulb casting long shadows across the cracked tiles. I glanced down the corridor, but there was no one around. I was completely alone. I reached for the door handle, half expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The apartment was dark, eerily silent. It smelled musty, like dust and forgotten memories. I fumbled for the light switch, but when I flipped it on, nothing happened. The power had been cut long ago, no doubt to save on the utility bills. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, casting a beam of light across the living room. The furniture was still in place, covered with sheets, as though the tenants had just left in a hurry. There was no sign of life, no movement, no sounds, and yet the sensation of being watched, of being followed, was overwhelming. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I walked through the apartment, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be. The air felt heavier in here, like the walls were closing in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I heard it. A soft shuffling, just like before. It came from the far side of the apartment, beyond the closed door that led to the bedroom. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to turn around, to leave, but I couldn't move. The sound was getting louder now, the floorboards creaking under the weight of something, or someone, moving through the room. The steps were slow, deliberate, almost like they were trying not to be heard. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow. There was no one here. There couldn't be. The apartment was empty, I told myself. But the sound kept getting closer, closer to the bedroom door. Without thinking, I reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the entire building. Inside, the room was pitch black, and the air felt colder, like I had just opened a door to the outside world in the dead of winter. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against me. I took a hesitant step inside, the flashlight beam cutting through the room like a blade. I swept it back and forth, but there was nothing. No one. Just empty space. The room was exactly as it should be, dusty, still, and abandoned. But then, from the far corner of the room, I saw it. A figure. Standing motionless, just barely visible in the shadows. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs and a shape that didn't seem to belong to a person. It was almost like a shadow, but solid, like it had been carved out of the darkness itself. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, like it was staring straight at me. The shuffling sound stopped. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then, the figure began to shift. It wasn't walking, not exactly. It was gliding, its body swaying in a way that was completely unnatural. It was coming closer. Slowly. Relentlessly. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what was happening. But I knew one thing, I had to leave. I had to get out of there before it reached me. I turned and bolted for the door, but as I ran, I felt something brush against my arm, a cold, clammy touch that sent shockwaves of fear through my body. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was back in my apartment, the door slamming shut behind me. I could hear the faint scratching from next door again, the same sounds I had been hearing for weeks. But now, they were louder, closer, and for the first time, I realized the truth. There was no one in that apartment. No one who could make those noises. There was something else that was living in that space, something that wasn't supposed to be there. And it was watching me. Always watching. The invisible neighbor. The one no one had ever seen. I couldn't escape it. It was in the walls. It was in the very air I breathed. And it wasn't going to let me go. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the soft scratching sound, the faint shuffle of footsteps from the apartment next door. It was as if the thing, whatever it was following me, moving closer and closer with each passing moment. I started to doubt my own mind. Was I imagining things? Was I letting my fear get the better of me? I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that it was all just my nerves playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, the one I had seen standing in the darkness of the bedroom. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, just beyond the walls, waiting for the right moment to make its move. I started to avoid the hallway, to stay locked inside my apartment as much as possible. But even then, the sounds didn't stop. They followed me, sneaking through the cracks of the building, seeping into my very thoughts. There was no escaping them. One evening, after days of being trapped in my own head, I decided to go downstairs. I needed to get some air, clear my mind, maybe find some sanity in the outside world. The air outside was cold, crisp, and for a moment, I felt a semblance of peace. But that peace didn't last long. I had barely stepped out the door when I heard it. The sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was a slow, deliberate creak, like a floorboard shifting under the weight of someone or something moving. It was coming from inside the building. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. It couldn't be. I had just left my apartment, and there was no one else in the building. I checked. The building was practically empty. There was no reason for anyone to be here. But the sound continued. And then, a new sound joined it, a low, guttural scraping, like nails dragging against metal. It sent a shiver down my spine, deep into my bones. I turned around and started walking back toward the building, my footsteps quickening as the sounds grew louder. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I had to know if it was real. I made my way back to my apartment and grabbed my phone. I had no plan, no idea what I was doing, but something inside me told me I needed to confront this. I needed to face whatever was lurking in the dark. I stood in the hallway, staring at the door to the apartment next door. The sounds were louder now, unmistakably close. I could hear the scraping, the shifting, as if something, or someone, was pacing back and forth, trapped in the room. I knocked on the door, my hand trembling. Nothing. I knocked again, this time harder, more insistent. But still, there was no answer. Then, I did something I never thought I would do. I grabbed the doorknob and turned it. To my surprise, it opened, just like it had the last time. The door creaked on its hinges, revealing the same dark, empty apartment. Nothing had changed. Except something was different. The air inside felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing against me, pushing me back. The silence was suffocating. I stepped inside, the faint creak of the floorboards echoing in the quiet. I moved deeper into the apartment, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The living room was as I remembered it, still and abandoned. But there was something else. A faint, almost imperceptible movement at the edge of my vision. A shadow, flickering, almost like a wisp of smoke. I spun around, but the shadow was gone. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was happening. I walked toward the bedroom, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. The door was still ajar, just like it had been the last time. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, the figure was there again. But it wasn't where I had seen it before. It was standing by the window, facing away from me, its form hazy, shifting in and out of the darkness. It was taller than before, its limbs impossibly long. And this time, it wasn't standing still. It was moving, swaying like a puppet on invisible strings. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, thick and oppressive in the air. The scratching sounds came again, louder now, closer. My pulse raced as I realized that the figure wasn't alone. There were others. I saw them then, more figures, emerging from the darkness, rising from the corners of the room. They were all the same, tall, shadowy, indistinct. They moved slowly, gliding across the floor like they were weightless, like they didn't belong in this world. And then, they turned toward me. Their faces, or what passed for faces, were featureless, blank. But I could feel their gaze, cold and heavy, like they were staring right through me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I had to leave. But as I turned to run, the door slammed shut in front of me. I was trapped. The figures closed in, their movements unnervingly slow, as if they were savoring the moment. I could hear the scraping sound now, right behind me, like they were closing in, ready to consume me. I backed into the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. And then, I heard something else. A voice, low and guttural, like it was coming from the very walls themselves. You shouldn't have come here. The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I had to get out. I had to. The lights flickered, and the room went black. The darkness swallowed me whole. My heart pounded in my ears, drying out everything else. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. It felt like the walls were closing in, pressing on me from all sides. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I thought I might suffocate. I staggered back, trying to find the door. My fingers brushed the cold, smooth surface of the wall as I reached out. But there was no door. No escape. The air was thick now, suffocating. And then, the sound. The same scraping, like nails on a chalkboard, but this time it was everywhere. From the corners of the room, from the ceiling, from beneath the floor. The scratching intensified, growing louder, sharper. I wanted to scream, but the fear lodged itself in my throat, rendering me silent. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, casting an eerie, flickering glow over the room. The figures were still there, standing in the corners, watching. The one closest to me, the one that had been standing by the window, moved toward me. It didn't walk. It glided, as if the ground wasn't solid beneath it, as if it didn't need to touch the floor at all. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the uneven floor. I needed to leave. I had to leave. But there was no way out. No door, no window, no escape. Why are you here? The voice came again, this time clearer. It wasn't a human voice, it was something far older, something that didn't belong. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling my mind, my thoughts. I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my lips trembling. The figure was closer now, its face, or what I could make of it, still blank and featureless. It had no eyes, no mouth, no nose. Only darkness where a face should be. And yet, I could feel its presence, its gaze piercing through me. You shouldn't have opened the door, it whispered. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like they were suffocating me from the inside. My heart raced, panic threatening to consume me. I couldn't think, couldn't focus. The figures were closing in, moving steadily, and I had no way out. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I fumbled for something to hold on to. My fingers brushed against the dresser, knocking something over. The crash of glass sent a jolt through me, but it wasn't the sound of broken glass that scared me. It was the way the figures reacted. They froze. For a moment, the entire room stood still, and in that brief silence, I could hear something faint, something moving, coming from the darkness beyond the room. It wasn't a figure. It was a presence. Something much larger. Something far more dangerous. I turned, instinctively reaching for the door again. But it was still closed. I was trapped. And then, I heard the breathing. It was deep, ragged, like something was breathing in the room with me, just behind me, its hot breath on the back of my neck. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Nothing that I could see. But I could feel it, something standing just out of sight, watching, waiting. My pulse raced, and I could feel the cold sweat soaking my skin. The scratching sound was now almost deafening, and the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in tighter with each breath I took. And then, everything stopped. The scratching, the breathing, the figures, they all vanished. The room fell into a heavy, unnatural silence. It was like nothing had ever been there, like I had imagined it all. But I knew better. I knew the darkness wasn't gone. It was still there, lingering, waiting for the right moment to return. I backed away from the center of the room, my breath ragged and uneven. My head spun, and I had to steady myself against the dresser. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. I needed to get out, but my mind was spinning. I had no idea where to go, what to do. The apartment felt like it was twisting, warping, bending around me. I could hear the faintest whisper of something, a voice, perhaps, but not a human voice. It echoed from the very walls, as if the room itself was speaking to me. "You've seen too much," it said. "Now you can never leave." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The words settled into my bones, icy and heavy, like a death sentence. I had opened the door. I had stepped into a world that wasn't mine, and now I was trapped. The lights flickered again, and this time they didn't come back on. The darkness swallowed everything, and the last thing I heard before the silence consumed me was the soft, insistent scratching, like something was coming closer. When the lights went out completely, I thought for a moment that my mind had finally shattered, that I was no longer seeing reality. The darkness felt like a living thing, thick and oppressive, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The air was stale, unbreathable, and every instinct in me screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The apartment was a labyrinth now, twisting, shifting, changing around me. I couldn't hear anything anymore. The voices, the scratching, the breathing, everything had fallen into a crushing silence. But that didn't make me feel safe. In fact, it only deepened the terror, because it meant that whatever was out there, whatever was lurking in the dark, was waiting. Watching. Waiting for me to make a mistake. I stumbled forward, my hands outstretched in front of me, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to. The air felt cold against my skin, the chill of an ancient presence pressing in from all sides. I couldn't see my hands in front of me, the darkness was so absolute. My feet shuffled forward blindly, and I felt my body tremble as I moved deeper into the apartment. I didn't know how long I had been walking. It could have been minutes, hours, time no longer seemed to matter. All I knew was that the silence was unbearable, and the fear in my chest was growing stronger by the second. And then, I heard it again. A soft creak, just at the edge of my hearing. So quiet, I almost thought I imagined it. But then, another creak, this time closer. It was coming from the hallway. Slowly, deliberately, like something, or someone, was pacing back and forth, waiting. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. I could feel it moving, creeping closer, surrounding me. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of that place, but I couldn't. I had no idea where I was, no sense of direction. It was as if the apartment itself had turned into a maze, trapping me in its shifting corridors. The creaking grew louder, more pronounced. It was coming toward me. Whatever it was moving with purpose. I held my breath, willing myself to be silent, to stay as still as possible. But then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking directly toward me. I could feel my pulse in my throat, could feel the sweat pouring down my back, my chest tightening with the pressure of the oncoming danger. I turned, panic rising in my throat, my eyes scanning the darkness, looking for anything, anyone. But there was nothing. Just the heavy silence. The footsteps continued, each one louder, closer. They were right outside the room. I could almost hear the person, or whatever it was, breathing, but still, nothing appeared. Then, in the blink of an eye, the door slammed shut. I was locked in. My breath came in ragged gasps. The silence was now deafening, and yet the tension was so thick I felt I might choke on it. The footsteps had stopped. But I knew they hadn't gone away. They were just waiting. Waiting for me to make a sound, to do something, anything. And then, a sound pierced the silence, sharper than all the others. A whisper. It was barely audible, but I heard it clearly. My name. A breathy, chilling sound, like someone was speaking directly into my ear. Jake. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest. There was no one. I could see nothing, just the black void of the room surrounding me, the shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. But I wasn't alone. The whisper came again, this time closer. Jake, come closer. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't just a voice that terrified me. It was the way it seemed to know me, the way it spoke my name with such familiarity, like it had been waiting for me. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, the air becoming so cold it burned, like a frigid wind cutting through me. I could see my breath in front of me, the vapor swirling in the oppressive silence. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, moving slowly toward me as though they were alive, reaching out to grab me. I backed away, my feet stumbling, but there was no escape. The door was still shut, and the walls seemed to be closing in on me. The darkness seemed to have a weight, a physical presence that pressed down on me, smothering me in its cold embrace. Then, I felt it. A hand. A cold, clammy hand that brushed against my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the shadows. I backed away, shaking, my body trembling with fear. I needed to get out. I needed to escape this place before it consumed me entirely. But when I turned toward the door, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The door was gone. It wasn't just closed, it had disappeared. The wall where the door had once been was solid now, as if the door had never existed at all. The only way forward was into the darkness. I could hear them now. More whispers. More figures emerging from the shadows, their forms flickering in and out of sight. Their voices were too many, overlapping, becoming louder, more frantic. I was trapped. And then, from the deepest shadow, a figure stepped forward. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its form shifting like smoke. But this time, I could see it clearly. It was the same figure from before, the one that had haunted the apartment. But now, it was more, its limbs longer, more twisted. Its face, though featureless, seemed to pulse with an energy that made my stomach turn. It was staring at me, but there were no eyes, no mouth, only darkness. And then, I heard it again. You can't leave now, Jake. You've seen too much. You're part of this world now. The darkness closed in, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never escape. The darkness had become thick, suffocating. It pressed down on me from all sides, closing in like the walls of a tomb. I could feel my legs shaking beneath me, but I couldn't move. The shadows had taken form, gathering around me, each one more terrifying than the last. They were all watching me now, waiting, as if savoring the fear that poured from me. I could hear them whispering. Their voices were low and indistinct, like a chorus of hushed murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. It was as though the very air itself had become charged with their presence. The tall figure was still there, standing at the edge of the shadows. It was closer now, its distorted form leaning toward me, its shape warping in the flickering light. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything, but I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. It was as if the very air had turned to stone, freezing me in place. You've seen too much, Jake, it whispered again, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. There's no way out. You belong to us now. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind spun in circles, struggling to grasp the reality of what was happening. I had thought, hoped, that this was just some kind of nightmare, a trick of my mind. But the terror was too real. The shadows, the whispers, the figure that now loomed before me, they were real. And I had been foolish enough to open the door. I tried to move, to break free of the hold this place had on me. But my body refused to obey. My legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor. The shadows pulled at me, tugging at my limbs, dragging me toward the center of the room. I felt their cold touch, their fingers like icy chains wrapping around my wrists, pulling me deeper into their grasp. The figure was closer now, right in front of me. I could see it more clearly than before. Its shape was almost human, but twisted, misshapen. Its limbs were too long, too thin, stretching out like branches of a dying tree. And its face, it had no eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Just endless blackness, as though the figure was made from the very darkness that surrounded it. I tried to scream, to run, to do anything to escape. But the darkness wouldn't let me. It consumed me, swallowed me whole. The whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. The words were a jumble, but one phrase cut through the noise. You can never leave. And then, everything went silent. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in that suffocating silence. My mind was racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what had happened, what was real and what wasn't. The shadows had vanished, but the feeling of their presence lingered, like a cold hand pressed against my skin. The figure was gone too, but I could still feel its eyes on me, though it had no eyes to see with. Slowly, the silence began to unravel. The air, once thick and oppressive, seemed to lighten just a little. My hands still trembled, my breath ragged, but the overwhelming fear had lessened only slightly. I took a step forward, almost afraid to move. My foot touched the floor, and for the first time, I felt the ground beneath me as it should be, solid. Real. But something was wrong. The room, the apartment, wasn't the same. The walls seemed to shift, their angles no longer quite right. The door was there again, but it was different. It looked like the door I had entered through, but the hallway beyond it was unfamiliar. The light from the hallway seemed too bright, too harsh, almost blinding. I stepped toward the door, hesitant, my hand reaching out. It felt cold under my fingertips, like it had been sitting in the dark for years. I could hear the whispers again. Faint, but growing louder. The sound seemed to come from beyond the door, from the hallway that now stretched out in front of me. Something was waiting. I pushed the door open slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The hallway beyond was long, stretching endlessly into the shadows. The walls were lined with old, peeling wallpaper, the floor creaking underfoot. But there was something off about it. Something wrong. I took another step into the hallway. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, like voices calling out to me from all directions. I tried to make out the words, but they were indistinct, overlapping with each other, becoming a strange, unintelligible chorus. I couldn't stop. My legs moved on their own, carrying me down the hallway, toward the darkness at the end. I couldn't see what was waiting for me, but I knew it was there. I could feel it, closing in on me, just out of sight. And then, I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hallway, just at the edge of the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting and contorting like it was made of smoke or darkness itself. It wasn't the same figure as before. This one was different. It didn't have the same human shape, the same twisted limbs. It was something else, something older, something more powerful. It spoke. "You shouldn't have come, Jake," it said, its voice deep and rumbling, like the sound of thunder. And then, it stepped forward. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The darkness seemed to rise around me, filling every corner of the hallway, swallowing the light. I could hear the figure moving toward me, the sound of its footsteps slow and deliberate. And then, I felt it, its presence, suffocating, overwhelming, like the air itself was alive with its power. There was no escape. The hallway stretched on forever, but it was closing in on me. The shadows had come to claim me. And I knew, in that moment, that I would never leave. Have you ever wondered if fate can be written in stone, its course already set before you even know it? What if you were to find out that your name is not just a part of who you are, but a marker, a point on a list, one that had already chosen your end? I didn't ask for this. In fact, I would have given anything not to find that damn book. It wasn't even a book I was looking for. I had just moved into an old apartment, the kind where everything creaks and groans like it has secrets it doesn't want to share. You know the type. The kind with narrow hallways and light that flickers just a bit too much. But that day, what was it now? A week ago? Maybe 2? I was cleaning out the back of a neglected closet, shoving aside old, dusty boxes filled with what seemed like forgotten relics of some distant life. I wasn't even sure whose life it was anymore. It didn't matter. I was just trying to make the place livable. And then I found it. A book, thick with age, its leather cover cracked and worn. No title, just an old symbol embossed on the front, like something out of a dream. At first, I thought it was just an antique, something someone had left behind. I didn't know what I was expecting, maybe a journal, maybe a diary. But when I opened it, my heart stopped. It wasn't a diary. The pages were filled with names. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe more. Each one written neatly, the ink still sharp, as though freshly inked. I felt an odd chill as I flipped through the pages, reading the names. Some of them were familiar, people I had known or heard of. The rest were strangers, faces that meant nothing to me. But as I turned to the last page, my hand froze. My name was there. It wasn't in the middle, no, it was the last name on the list. The final entry. I stared at it, my mind racing, heart pounding. There was no mistake. It was my name, my full name. The exact same one I saw on my ID every day. The thought struck me like a bolt of lightning. Why was my name there? Why was it written at the end? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of prank, some weird coincidence. After all, I didn't know the history of this apartment or the people who had lived here before. Maybe someone just put a list together of names for some strange reason. But then I noticed something else. The other names on the list, they were all crossed out. Every single one of them. Except mine. A wave of nausea hit me. I couldn't breathe. I slammed the book shut, but the image of my name on that list lingered in my mind. Why was it there? Why was it the last one? And why were all the other names crossed out? The thought of it gnawed at me. Was it a warning? A prophecy? A promise? I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I had to get rid of the book. Maybe that would make everything go away. Maybe it would just be a distant memory, something I could laugh about later. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the feeling wouldn't leave me. And then, I began to hear things. At first, it was just a whisper, faint and distant. A soft, barely audible sound coming from somewhere in the apartment. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, or maybe the old pipes groaning. But the sound didn't stop. It lingered, growing louder each night, until it became impossible to ignore. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the pipes. It was a voice. The voice didn't say anything at first. It was just there, echoing through the walls like a low hum. But as the days passed, it began to take shape. It began to speak my name. You're next. I would hear it in the dead of night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. It would say my name in that soft, almost soothing tone, but there was something dark about it. Something cold. I would wake up, heart racing, drenched in sweat, convinced that I had been dreaming. But it wasn't a dream. I started to look over my shoulder when I walked through the hallways, half expecting someone to be there, lurking in the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me, waiting. It wasn't until the third night that things escalated. I was sitting in the living room, reading through the pages of the book again, trying to make sense of it all. My hands shook as I turned the pages, as if the very act of reading it was enough to make my heart race. And then, as I read one name after another, it hit me. Every person on the list, every single one of them, had died. There were no dates next to the names, but I knew. The moment I recognized the names, I remembered the headlines, the obituaries, the funeral notices. People I had known, people I had heard about, all dead. The list was a record of their lives, of their fates. And now it was my turn. You're next. It came again, louder this time, the voice almost in my ear. It was no longer a whisper. It was clear, unmistakable, as though it had moved closer. I jumped out of my seat, my pulse racing. My breath came in short gasps, panic spreading through my chest. What was happening? Was this some kind of sick joke? Had someone been watching me all along? Was I being haunted by something beyond this world? I slammed the book shut again, this time tossing it across the room. But the whisper didn't stop. It was in my head now, repeating over and over. You're next. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind was spiraling, but I couldn't stop myself from looking at the clock. Time was ticking, and the list wasn't going to wait. I knew my time was running out. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. It was already too late. I spent the next few hours pacing the apartment, trying to shake off the panic that gripped me. I couldn't stay still. My legs were restless, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't contain. I'm going crazy, I thought. This is just stress. It's nothing. It's all in my head. But even as I tried to reason with myself, I knew deep down that something was wrong. The list, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The names, the dead, and the one name that remained uncrossed. My name. I had to know more. I needed answers. I grabbed the book again, my fingers trembling as I opened it to the first page. The silence of the room felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing against me. The only sound was my shallow breathing and the rustling of the pages as I flipped through them. Every name on the list was crossed out, every name except mine. As I stared at the final page, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The names were arranged in a pattern. A rhythm, almost, that I couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't random, and the more I looked at it, the more I could feel the connection. There was a reason my name was last. There was a reason it hadn't been crossed out. I looked at the last name again. My name. No, this can't be real. It just can't be. I slammed the book shut and jumped to my feet. My heart pounded and my hands felt clammy. I had to get rid of it. Throw it away. Burn it. I didn't care how. I just needed to erase it, to pretend it had never existed. But as I rushed toward the door, ready to toss the book in the trash, I heard the sound again. The whisper. You're next. This time, it was louder. Clearer. It wasn't coming from the book, it was coming from inside my head. I froze, unable to move. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within, a twisted, haunting echo that wrapped itself around my thoughts, tightening like a vice. Who are you? I thought, my mind screaming. What do you want? But the voice didn't answer. Instead, I heard something else. Something more disturbing. A slow, deliberate scraping noise, like fingernails dragging across the floor. It wasn't in my mind anymore. It was real. It was in the apartment. I turned toward the sound. The hallway. The sound was coming from the hallway, just beyond the door. I stood there for a moment, frozen. I didn't know what to do. My body felt like it was paralyzed, like my own fear had stolen control from me. But then, the scraping stopped. And in that moment of silence, I realized the true horror. I wasn't alone. I slowly walked toward the door, my hand trembling as it reached for the handle. Every step felt heavier, like I was moving through mud. The scrape had stopped, but there was still something out there. Something waiting. I opened the door just a crack, my heart racing in my chest. The apartment was dark, the dim light from the hallway casting long shadows on the walls. Nothing. But I could feel it. I could feel that presence. It was there, watching, waiting. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away from it, my eyes darting around the room. I needed to get out of here. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. I turned to grab my jacket, ready to leave, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure. In the reflection of the window, just behind me. I didn't even have time to scream. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring back at me. It was dark, indistinct, like a shadow without shape. But I knew it was there. I turned around quickly, expecting to see nothing. But the room was empty. I ran to the window, tearing open the blinds, desperate to see something outside. But the street below was empty. No one. Just the empty, dark street that stretched out into the distance. I slammed the blinds shut and backed away from the window. What the hell is happening? The figure was still there. I could feel it, hovering at the edge of my vision. But when I looked directly at it, it was gone. The next few hours blurred together in a haze of fear and confusion. I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I needed to get out, but every time I tried to leave, that voice would come again. You're next. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape them. Whoever they were. The list. The names. They were all connected. And I was the last one. The doorbell rang at some point, snapping me out of my frantic thoughts. I rushed to the door, my heart still racing, unsure who would be visiting at this hour. It was late, almost midnight. I peeked through the peephole. No one was there. But on the doormat was something. Something small, barely noticeable in the dim light. A piece of paper. I bent down and picked it up. My hand shook as I unfolded it, the note crinkling in my grip. It was short, written in a hand I didn't recognize. You can't hide forever. We see you. My stomach churned. I didn't know who had written it. I didn't care. But one thing was certain, the list was no coincidence. And neither was the shadow that followed me. Something was coming for me. and it was too late to escape. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt tight, and my heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, holding the note. "We see you." The words echoed in my mind, sending a chill through my entire body. Whoever had left that note was still watching me. They knew I was here, and that meant I was running out of time. I threw the note aside and rushed to the window, pulling the blinds open to check the street below once more. Nothing. No one. The streets were empty. But it didn't feel empty. It felt wrong, like something was lurking just outside of my sight. I backed away from the window and turned to look at the apartment around me. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows stretching longer, darker. The silence was suffocating, like it was pressing on me from every direction. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I scrolled through my contacts. Who could I call? Who would believe me if I told them? Who would help? There was no one. I stopped scrolling. The only name left on my phone screen that mattered was my own. And I didn't need to be reminded of that. My name, like the last name on that list, was now a countdown. And soon, it would be crossed out. I put the phone down, staring at it for a long moment. My mind was racing, but there were no clear answers. No plans. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay here. But where could I go? Then, the thought hit me like a sudden jolt. The list. I had to find the book again. Without another thought, I dashed toward the living room, my feet slapping against the floor, my pulse roaring in my ears. I had to figure this out. I had to understand what was happening before it was too late. I found the book exactly where I had left it. I grabbed it with shaking hands, flipping through the pages, my eyes scanning each name once again. There had to be something I missed. Something that could give me a chance. But no matter how hard I looked, there was nothing more. No answers. Just a list. Names all crossed out, and mine at the very end. As I stared at the page, something strange happened. The words started to shift. The ink seemed to blur, swirling on the page. The names, they were changing. They were shifting. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, sure that I was imagining things. But when I looked again, the names had changed. The ink was still moving, twisting like something alive. And then, I saw it. One of the names, the one directly before mine, was changing. The letters were not just fading, they were being erased. Scratched out, leaving nothing behind but a blank space. I reached out instinctively, touching the page, my fingers brushing the ink. But before I could pull my hand away, the air around me seemed to grow colder, denser, and then, the scraping sound. That same noise. Only this time, it was louder. It was real. I turned around, my heart in my throat. It was coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes darting toward the door. There it was again. The figure. It wasn't just a shadow now. It was more solid, more distinct. The dark silhouette was standing at the end of the hallway, watching me with empty eyes. The air around it rippled, like something wasn't quite right with the space itself. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. It was there, so real, so present, and yet so impossible at the same time. I felt my legs trembling beneath me, and before I could stop myself, I bolted toward the door. I had to get out. I had to get away from this. But as I reached the door, my hand grasping the handle, I heard it. "You're next." The voice was clearer now, closer. It wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the very walls. The air. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, but the figure was no longer there. The hallway was empty. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave the building, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. That it wasn't just a figure, I was being hunted. I stumbled backward, running toward the stairs, but then the door to the apartment beside mine opened. I froze. The door creaked, slowly swinging wide. No one stepped out. No one appeared. But the door was open, and it was the apartment, the one next to mine. The one that had been empty for as long as I could remember. I approached it slowly, unsure of what I was about to find. The silence was unnerving. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. I reached the doorway and hesitated. And then, without thinking, I crossed the threshold. Inside was the same as it had always been, or at least as I remembered it. Dust-covered furniture, shadows pooling in the corners of the room. But something was different now. The air felt thick, heavy with an oppressive weight. And there, in the middle of the room, was a figure. It wasn't the shadow from before. It was something else. Something more human. A man. Or at least, what looked like a man. He stood completely still, his face hidden in the shadows. His hands were at his sides, but I could feel his gaze on me, even though I couldn't see his eyes. I should have run. I should have left. But I didn't. I walked closer. And then, just before I could reach him, I heard something behind me. The sound of scratching. Slow. Purposeful. Like it was coming from inside the walls. And with each scratch, the shadow in front of me seemed to grow. I was no longer alone. And I had no idea how I would survive what was coming next. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if it was trying to break free from the walls, from the very foundation of the building itself. I wanted to turn around, to flee, but my legs felt like they were frozen in place. The figure in front of me, the man, remained perfectly still, his presence filling the room with an undeniable weight. It was as though everything in this place had been waiting for me to walk in. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows around him seemed to shift, moving of their own accord, as if they were alive. I could feel them curling around me, reaching for me with invisible hands. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice cracking. I didn't expect an answer. I wasn't sure if I even wanted one. But the silence that followed felt worse than anything he could have said. The man didn't move. But then, a strange sound came from his direction, a soft, guttural noise, like a sigh, but it wasn't his breath. It was something deeper, something that didn't belong to a human at all. Then, as if in response to my question, the shadows around him grew darker, thicker, swirling like a storm contained within a single point. "Not who you think," the voice came again, this time not from his lips, but from all around me, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, the very air. It vibrated in my bones, cold and hollow. I took a step back, my pulse quickening, my mind racing. What did it mean? Not who I think. And then it clicked, the list. The names. The way the ink had shifted, changed, disappeared. My name was on it. The last name. But before mine, the names had been erased. It was all connected. The book, the list, the figure in front of me. And that voice, It wasn't the figure's voice. It was the voice of everything around me, of the walls, the apartment, the city. The scratching came again, louder, like claws against the drywall. But this time, the sound was accompanied by something else. A thumping. Heavy footsteps echoing through the hallway outside. Something, or someone, was approaching. I didn't wait to find out what. I turned and sprinted down the hallway, my feet pounding against the floor, but the footsteps behind me were faster, closer. The air seemed to thicken, pushing against me, holding me back. The shadows on the walls seemed to reach out, grasping at me like hands. The door to my apartment was just ahead. I was almost there. I glanced behind me, and that was when I saw it. The figure had moved. It wasn't where it had been just moments ago. It was closer now, its silhouette sharp and distinct, its form no longer just a shadow, but something tangible, a presence that stretched and swelled like it was taking shape before my eyes. It was coming for me. I stumbled, tripping over my own feet as I reached the door. My hand shook as I grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't open. The lock was stuck, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I pulled harder, panicked, until finally, with a loud click, the door swung open. I ran inside, slamming it shut behind me. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and I pressed my back against the door, my hand shaking as I turned the lock. But even as I stood there, gasping for air, I could feel it. It was still out there, watching, waiting. The scratching stopped. The thumping stopped. The house was eerily silent. I didn't dare move at first. I stood there, my eyes scanning the apartment, searching for any sign of the man or whatever had been pursuing me. But there was nothing. Only the heavy silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I finally let out a shaky breath and turned to the living room. But as I did, my eyes locked onto something that made my heart stop cold. The book. It was open on the coffee table, the pages turning on their own, flipping rapidly as though caught in an unseen wind. I hadn't left it like that. I hadn't opened it since the last time I looked at it, since the names had started changing. But now, the pages were flipping faster, the ink on each name bleeding, running down the page like liquid, as if the list itself was being erased by something much darker than ink. And then, I saw it. The last name on the list, mine, was changing. The ink was no longer just fading or blurring. It was being rewritten. The letters were shifting, reforming into something new. I couldn't look away, even as my skin crawled, even as a deep dread filled my chest. It was as if the book was calling to me, pulling me in, beckoning me toward my own fate. And then, the voice. It's too late now. The words came not from the book, not from the shadows, but from somewhere inside me. They felt like they were coming from the very marrow of my bones. I staggered backward, my breath quickening, my vision blurring. Too late to escape. The voice was now all-encompassing, filling the room, filling my head, until I couldn't tell where it ended and I began. It was everywhere. And then, I felt it. The change. The apartment felt different. It no longer felt like a place I recognized. The walls seemed to breathe, the floor beneath me seemed to ripple. Everything was warping, twisting, pulling at the edges of reality. And in the center of it all, the figure. It was standing right in front of me now, no longer a shadow, no longer a whisper. It was solid. It was real. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel the coldness of its gaze, the emptiness. And I knew. It was time. The last name on the list had been crossed out. Mine. And I had nowhere left to run. I tried to scream, but my throat felt tight, constricted as though the air itself was choking me. I opened my mouth, desperate to make some sound, to warn myself, to call out for help, but nothing came. My chest tightened, and a cold sweat coated my skin as I watched the figure move closer, its form stretching like dark ink across the room. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the floor that now seemed to twist and distort under me. My heart raced faster than I could follow, my breath coming in gasps, shallow and panicked. The book was still open on the coffee table, the last name written in smeared ink, slowly being erased. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. There was no denying it now. The ink was vanishing in front of me, the letters fading as if they were never meant to be written in the first place. The figure was now right in front of me, its presence so close that I could feel its chill seep into my bones. It was no longer just a shadow, but something else. Something more. It was as though the space around it warped, grew darker, more suffocating. I could feel the air thinning, growing heavier by the second. You shouldn't have looked. The voice was everywhere again, swirling around me, making it impossible to pinpoint where it came from. I tried to move, but my legs refused to obey, and I found myself rooted in place. The figure stepped closer, its face still obscured by the swirling shadows, but its outline became clearer. The edges of it seemed to pulse, as though it was not entirely in this world. Too late. The voice was clearer now. I could almost feel its breath on the back of my neck, cold and dry. And then, the book, the list of names, flipped one last time. The pages turned of their own accord, faster and faster, until the whole book seemed to spin in midair. It was as if it was no longer just a book, but a portal to something else. Something darker, far beyond the limits of this reality. I looked at the final page, where my name had been written. It was gone. Completely erased, as if it had never existed. In its place, there was something new. A single word, written in dark ink, waiting. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. My entire body went numb, and I could hear a faint sound. The sound of scratching, just like before, only now it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside my own head. It was as if the sound itself was carving its way into my mind, pulling at the very fabric of who I was. You were always meant to be here. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward me, the fingers elongated, impossibly thin, but somehow too real. I tried to turn, to run, but my legs refused to move, like they were stuck in concrete. The shadows wrapped around me, tugging at my skin, pulling me closer to the figure. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing against me, the ceiling lowering. It felt like I was being drawn into the book itself, being consumed by the dark ink that was now forming words across the walls, crawling across the floor, twisting around me like a living thing. My vision blurred, and I felt a pull in my chest, as though I was being dragged somewhere far beyond this place, far beyond reality itself. And then, the world went black. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was in a different place entirely. It was cold, and the walls around me seemed to stretch endlessly, covered in black, swirling patterns. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural weight, as if the space itself was not meant to be. There was no light, but I could feel the presence of something watching me. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I could only stand there, frozen in place, as if waiting for something. No, not waiting. I realized with a sinking feeling. I was the one being waited for. I was the last name on the list, the final one. And now, there was no escape. No way out. The shadows closed in, wrapping around me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. The figure appeared again, standing at the edge of my vision, but it was no longer just a figure. It had become part of the space, part of the very fabric of this place. Welcome home. The voice was now a low hum in my mind, echoing with the weight of 1,000 whispers. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I was trapped in this world, a world where the list of names had never truly ended. It had just begun again with me. And as the darkness engulfed me, I understood. The list was never about who would live. It was always about who would be next. And I had become the last. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.